Mauled, Were Soldier Warriors, Book 3. Written by Kim Dillon. Narrated by Nikki Kwiatkowski. Chapter 1. We lost Mrs. Mbez. Dr. Stephanie Carter felt something in her wither and shrivel at the words. She didn't let any of it show on her face, however, as she looked up from the microscope that she was using. When? She asked, her voice placid. Just half an hour ago, said Jessica. The new doctor looked painfully young to Stephanie, even though she knew that the difference in their ages wasn't all that dramatic. Sometimes, Stephanie felt as if she were 1,000,000 years old, far older than everyone around her. Some days she felt as if she was older than the continent on which they stood. And was it the same as the others? Jessica nodded. Exact same symptoms, exact same boils, so that makes 4 altogether. I ate dinner with Mrs. Mbez and her family last week. Stephanie thought numbly. I got to pet her pretty honey-colored dog, and I sat with her grandson in my lap. She smiled and told me how I was cooking yams wrong, and that I should come back so that she could teach me how to do it the right way, the Tanzanian way. Stephanie refused to let any of that show in her face. She was as still as a glacial pond, cold and remote. From the slightly apprehensive look on Jessica's face, she could tell that the young doctor was at least a little intimidated by her. Good. A little bit of healthy fear kept everyone in line, especially in an outfit as small and remote as this one. All right, that's that then, said Stephanie. As of this point on, we are under quarantine conditions. We're going to need to spend some time examining all the other villagers. We want to establish treatment protocols for the ones who are sick, as well as preventative education for those who aren't. Let's keep those who aren't symptomatic as healthy as we can for as long as possible. A part of Stephanie, the part that had worked for the WHO for a decade, knew that this was uncommon procedure. She had been at the forefront of enough forays against disease that this one was just one more. However, there was another part of her, one that had just started making itself known a short time ago, one that she thought might have been shut up tightly in a box all her life, that was protesting. This will be so much agony, that insistent voice argued. There is going to be so much pain and fear and misery, and at the end of it, you will be just a little more broken than you were before. Stephanie shrugged that voice away, but she couldn't help the feeling that it was becoming more persistent over time. Jessica was looking at her with something strange in her eyes, and Stephanie frowned. Well, what is it? She snapped, and she saw the younger doctor flinch. This is going to be serious, isn't it? She asked. Those tests that I brought, they just confirmed it, didn't they? Stephanie hesitated for a moment. There was something about the younger doctor that Stephanie rather liked, but she was new to camp, unlike some of the other staff who had been working with Stephanie for years. No one who knew her would have called Stephanie a gambling woman, but the truth was that she was a risk-taker by nature. You couldn't spend years going to hot spots all over the world that had been designated high risk without being so. She took chances. Can I trust you? She asked, and when Jessica automatically nodded, Stephanie snorted and seized her by the arm. Jessica bit off a gasp and looked up at Stephanie, startled. God, she looked so young. I mean it, she said. What I tell you, you can't repeat to anyone beyond our staff. Not even that man that you keep sneaking off to meet. The look of pure shock on Jessica's face nearly made Stephanie laugh. Look, I don't care if he's a local man, or a bush pilot, or a smuggler, or what. What I need from you is your word that you are not going to reveal to anyone else what I am about to disclose. Is that clear? Crystal, Jessica said, and Stephanie relaxed her grip. The truth was that she didn't care to say it aloud. Not really. She wanted to put it off, deny that it was happening. She hadn't gotten as far as she had in her career by denying reality, however. And Stephanie took a deep breath. We're looking at something that's entirely unfamiliar to modern medicine, she said quietly. Especially to modern medicine as we know it. It looks like nothing I've ever encountered before, and we are going to have to pray like hell that this condition responds to something we've got in our toolkit. Otherwise, at the rate at which people are falling ill and dying, it might be unstoppable. Jessica said with wide eyes, and Stephanie nodded grimly. That is correct. Now, is there anything else before I continue with my work? She had thought that her acid tone would have driven the girl off, but Jessica seemed to be made of sterner stuff than some of the newbie docs Stephanie usually got sent in the jungle. Instead of scuttling off, chastened, Jessica looked at her speculatively. I have a colleague. She's a friend, too. But she's a specialist in blood and blood-borne pathogens. She's working at the CDC in Atlanta right now. If she could get WHO clearance... Stephanie nodded. If she could, she might be invaluable here. In all fairness, though, I wouldn't expect too much. Researchers don't spend a lot of time on the ground. They're usually a little too arrogant to mix it up with the people who are actually using the blood that they're studying. Jessica grinned an unexpected gesture that took her from merely cute to beautiful. With her short black hair and slender frame, it was hard to remember that Jessica had not only survived a plane crash, but then traversed miles and miles of hostile terrain with a bush pilot. This one might surprise you, she promised, and then she was gone. After she was alone in the medical tent, Stephanie stopped for a moment. Stillness was a state that was more than a little foreign to her. When she was working, she had to be on top of things, always alert for the next disaster. Right now, her hands stilled, and it was almost as though her body robotically came to a gentle rest. I am so tired, she thought, and then she forced herself to get back to work. Stephanie thought that at night, no matter what was going on, medical camps like this one found a different sort of life. During the day, it was all about a hustle for survival. After all, no one called in the World Health Organization when everything was hunky-dory, as a colleague had wryly commented once. And Stephanie knew that that was true. She and those like her often felt more than a little bit hopeless, carrying the banner of survival just a few feet in front of what felt like terrible suffering and torment nipping at their heels. At night, most camps felt soothing, if exhausted. No matter how frenetic things had been during the day, twilight brought something restful about the camp. Not tonight. Tonight, the camp buzzed with low level of terror. She could see people frowning more nervously about what the morning might bring. Enough of them had seen the ravaged bodies of the newly dead to be very concerned. Stephanie had to say that she herself had never seen anything like it. First, there was a fever and a sense of being crushed. Then boils appeared all over the body, dark and almost obscenely shiny. After that, there was a period of everything being paused and in suspense that usually lasted for no more than 24 hours. And then massive organ failure set in. Stephanie had seen it happen firsthand 3 times now. Mrs. Mbez would be number 4, and that meant that the first duty that she shared with the other medical professionals in the field was to alleviate suffering and to work towards finding a cure. The WHO had been briefed on everything that was going on in the remote area of Tanzania, but she knew that their help might be sporadic. For the foreseeable future, they were on their own. Stephanie received her food and suddenly found that she couldn't stand camp for 1 moment longer. It was too much tonight. There was a camaraderie that the camp shared that she could not, simply by virtue of being the woman in charge. She did her job, and she did it well, but there was a part of her that resented it. Right now, with the controlled panic thrumming through the air and all looks being thrown her way, Stephanie knew that she had to get out of camp for her own sanity. She dumped off her plate with a clatter and without a single look back, stalked off into the trees. The village and the camp were situated on the tree line between the jungle and the grasslands. On one side there was a dark jungle, one where animals stalked under the canopy of thick leaves and lush vegetation. On the other side was the open grassland, rolling underneath an enormous dark blue sky. This far from the cities, the blackness of the night sky was absolute. But the moon was already rising. It was almost full that night, would likely be full by the next night. If she waited another half-hour or so, she knew that the moon would light the land up nearly as bright as day. But she didn't know if she could take the light right then. It would have sounded silly if she'd said it out loud, but the thought occurred to her that she simply didn't want to be seen at all. She wanted to hide out, no, to disappear. There were a number of trails leading into the jungle that the locals used, slender paths that resembled deer trails more than anything else. She found one soon enough, and even though she knew how dangerous a solo walk could be, Stephanie stepped onto the trail without a moment's hesitation. "I'm not running away," she told herself, even if she herself was not necessarily convinced. When she stepped under the dark canopy of the jungle, it felt to Stephanie a little bit like she was being swallowed. Right then, however, that felt just fine. Chapter 2. Stephanie figured that other people, at times like this, likely felt homesick. They longed for a place where they were loved without reservation or lived without fear. They wanted to crawl back to a place that they thought was safe. Stephanie never felt like that. She had been born and raised in a small town in Texas, a place that could barely be found on a map. The population hovered somewhere around 5,000, and her family was one just like any other. Her parents were perhaps less kind than she might have wished them to be, but they were distant rather than abusive. They didn't care much what she did as long as she was quiet and out of sight while she did it. Stephanie had found comfort in books and studying. She worked hard in school, mostly because she enjoyed the challenge, and she eventually found herself with a full scholarship to a state school. After graduating in an accelerated course, she went right on to medical school. She had been interested in helping others since she was a child, and medical school seemed like the best path in which to realize that objective. She had found her place at the WHO almost immediately after her residency, and considered it to be the perfect avenue in which to put her skills to use. Still, she walked through the verdant vegetation, appreciating the life all around her, and keeping her feet on the path as best she could. She knew that losing her way could mean far worse than spending the night shivering in the dark and cold. The jungle was dangerous during the day, deadly at night. She was taking a risk being out like this, and she wasn't sure why. That was a lie. She did know why. She knew that somehow, even underneath the wide-open Tanzanian sky, she was feeling a weighty pressure descending over her. There was something nasty heading this way. There was something nasty on its way here right now, and she wanted nothing more than to get away from it all. Stephanie knew that fantasizing about running away was as far as she'd go. To think that she'd actually run was being foolish. She would never forgive herself if it came down to it. She could no more leave her posting than a bird could decide to walk for the rest of its life. She wanted to help these people. As a matter of fact, sometimes she strongly suspected that she needed to. Stephanie realized how long she had been wandering when she noticed that the light coming through the trees was far fainter. The moon would set soon, and that meant that she would truly be at the mercy of the jungle. She knew from the villagers' stories that jungle mercy was short indeed, and she started to hurry back. Only, which way had she come? Stephanie had been fairly certain that the path that she'd taken had not branched out at all, nor had it harbored twists or turns. However, after a few minutes of walking, she wasn't sure she recognized anything at all. She passed a rock formation that she was certain she hadn't seen before, and when she passed it again, she knew that she was well and truly lost. Oh, God damn it, she swore, trying to cover up her anxiety. She knew this was bad. People got lost in the jungle, and under certain, maybe most, circumstances, they were never seen again. Rarely were their remains even found. The team would never know what happened to her. People would continue to die, and she would be forgotten. Get a hold of yourself, she thought. You know what to do in this situation. The basic bush training that she had gotten was clear. If you were lost, you stayed still if you were close enough to people who could find you. There was no reason to think that she had wandered that far after all. She could simply sit down in the shelter of this stone formation. Daylight would mean that she could find her way out or that someone would come looking for her. She settled down on the cool ground, wrapping her arms around her knees. She knew that her plan was the right one. In the morning, she could drink the dew from the trees and start making her way back. It would be simple in the daylight. I'll be fine, even if I have to suffer a little embarrassment, she thought ruefully. They'll be laughing at me for weeks for getting lost like some sort of greenhorn. She somehow managed to doze off a little, but then she heard what sounded like a growl. She awakened with a start, scrambling to her feet and staring hard into the dark. She wished she had had the foresight to carry a flashlight when she'd gone wandering. As it was, Stephanie strained her eyes through the darkness. There was only the typical night noises at first, but then there was another growl, followed by a tearing, crashing sound in the underbrush. At first, she assumed that all the noise was made by only one animal, but quickly she realized that there were two. What the hell is out there? She wondered frantically. The noises got louder and louder until she realized that the animals must be fighting right beyond her line of sight. And then, with no warning at all, the noise ceased. Stephanie was just releasing the breath she'd been holding in a sigh of relief when the bushes rustled and a man walked out. Of all the things that Stephanie thought might have ended up happening to her that night, this was at the very bottom of the list. She had thought that she was entirely alone in the jungle, and if she was going to imagine a man in there with her, she was pretty sure her brain lacked the creativity to dream up this one. He was an enormous man, tall and broad, though without an ounce of fat on his imposing frame. He was dressed simply in the khaki outfits that were worn by so many of the officials and game wardens in this part of the world, but otherwise, he looked like no man that she had ever seen. His pale hair, impossible to discern the actual color in the dimness, fell in waves to his shoulders, and his face was chiseled as if from rock. It was a strong face, perhaps one given to sternness, but a part of her warmed to him immediately. "Who are you?" he asked with frank curiosity, and she drew herself up nervously. "I'm a doctor," she said bluntly. "I'm from the base camp at the edge of the jungle." The enormous man raised an eyebrow, making her feel as if she was a confused 10-year-old. "Base camp? That's some distance away," he said. "Too far for a nighttime stroll, I would think." "Well, I at least have a reason to be in the area," she shot back. "What are you doing here?" Her implication was clear. Tanzania was a beautiful land with amazing animals and resources. It also spent a great deal of time and money fighting off poachers and smugglers who were looking to take advantage of its resources. The man didn't look like a poacher or a smuggler, but why in the world would he be out here otherwise? Instead of taking offense at her insinuation, he laughed. She was forced to admit that he did indeed have a very nice laugh. It rolled out of him, a warm and golden rumbling sound that made her want to close her eyes and rest her head against his chest. "Let's say I'm here on business," he replied, and though Stephanie knew that he couldn't see her, she raised an eyebrow. "What kind of business?" she asked. "Legal and righteous business," he said, and she knew with that she would have to be content. "Well, that's very nice for you," she said stiffly. He cocked his head at her, and in that moment, she had a fleeting vision of a cat. There was something very feline about him. Cats, whether they were house cats or pumas, always seemed to act as if they owned the world. That was how the man looked now, as if he was wondering how she had gotten into his world. "Sometimes. Other times it's a pain in the ass. And you? Are you merely out for an evening stroll?" "Something like that," she muttered. She wished she could leave it at that, but she knew that that would not necessarily be wise where her well-being was concerned. "I'm lost," she sighed, and though she expected him to laugh, he did not. "That's a shame. It is a good thing, then, that I have found you." Stephanie wanted to say something in response, but to her shock, he stepped close to her. When they were less than a foot away from one another, she could smell him. A scent of sweet grass and open sky and something uniquely male. She lingered on the scent for a moment, and then she snapped out of it. Scowling, she gave him a push to get him away from her. God, he's as stable as a wall, she thought, but she glared up at him anyway. "What's the matter with you?" she asked indignantly, ready to fight, and he smiled, showing off a glint of white teeth. "Nothing at all." For no good reason at all, he lifted his face to the wind. He seemed to be waiting for something, and then he nodded. "All right. You have wandered quite a way, haven't you?" he asked. "You had better let me get you home. If you follow me, you'll be safe in your bed in an hour or less. How does that sound?" "How do I know that you're not simply going to murder me and dump me in a ditch?" she demanded, and he smiled again, something that did not strike her as necessarily nice. "Well, you don't," he said. "I might decide that I want to lead you in circles around in the dark, or perhaps kidnap you, sell you on the black market, where you would be one hell of a prize commodity." She bared her teeth at him. This area of the world was prone to human traffickers, and she had no interest in joining the ranks of their victims. "I'd like to see you try," she snarled, and he fell back, raising his hands for peace. "I'm sorry, that was a bad joke. I didn't realize how frightened you were." It came to the tip of her tongue to deny that she was afraid, but the truth was so palpable that she couldn't deny it. "How do you know that I'm frightened?" she asked in a soft whisper. God, for such a big man, he was fast. One hand came out to run a feather-light touch down her cheek before she even noticed. "Because you are being brave," he said. "That usually means a person is afraid." She didn't know what she should make of that, but the compassion in his voice came through loud and clear. "Will you allow me to take you back to where you belong?" he asked, and she managed a tiny nod. "Yes." He grinned again, and this time it was at least a little gentler. "Good girl," he said. He held out his hand to her, and without thinking about what she was doing, she took it. His enormous fingers closed around hers, his touch gentle and considerate. "What's your name?" she asked as they started to walk. "Noah," he answered. "And you?" "Dr. Stephanie Carter," she responded, and he smiled at her with a little bit of pleasure. "That's a mouthful," he said. "Do you answer to anything shorter?" She drew up to her full height, which wasn't that far, and glared at him. Was he being snide? She had dealt with thinly disguised derogatory comments most of her career, and she was not prone to giving the benefit of the doubt to a man, even a man who was helping her. "Just Dr. Carter," she said tersely. "Or, if you must, Stephanie." Stephanie. He ran the name over his tongue as if it were an exotic liqueur, and something about it made her blush. The man, Noah, she reminded herself, turned to her with a gentle smile. "It is a beautiful name," he said. "It suits you. Beautiful." She barked a laugh. "It's been a very long time since anyone called me beautiful," she snorted. "I don't have much to do with being pretty when it comes to work." Noah looked at her curiously, still leading her through the forest. This was getting a little more familiar, she thought gratefully. Whoever this man was, it didn't seem as if he was leading her astray. "You may do ugly work," he rumbled. "But no, you're right, you are not pretty." Stephanie felt a little like someone had kicked her in the chest. She knew she wasn't pretty. She had had more than 30 years to come to the realization that she was barely above plain. She was slender with no curves to speak of. Her dirt brown hair was most often tied back into a ponytail. She never wore makeup, and her eyes were a pale blue, nothing special at all. She knew that. However, she couldn't remember a condemnation of her looks hurting so much since high school. She started to say something dismissive, but Noah was still talking. "Pretty is far too insipid a term for you. You're alluring, engaging, exquisite, beautiful." "Are you trying to get laid? Because, mister, I really don't go for one-night stands even in the middle of the jungle, no matter how handsome the man might be." "Handsome?" he asked, and there was something so guileless about the way he said the word that she wondered if he was messing with her. "I'll take that as high praise indeed, since I don't think you're the type to hand out praise lightly." She wasn't, but then he was speaking again. "I will say that when something as delectable as you crosses my path, I don't usually hesitate. But you don't seem as though you would welcome it. You smell like you've got something else on your mind." Smell? Shouldn't that have been look? She dismissed it from her mind. "I do," Stephanie admitted, and suddenly she recognized a stream that she knew very well. If she continued on the path to the south, she would find the campsite again easily. In less than 20 minutes, she would be within sight of her camp. "This is where I need to be," she said. "Thank you, and I will not allow you to come any farther." He looked at her in surprise, and she knew that if this man wanted to challenge her, she was not going to be able to stop him. However, instead of fighting her, Noah looked at her quizzically again. Embarrassed to be seen with a man who led you out of the woods?" I wish it was as simple as my reputation, she growled. There's an illness here. My team and I are trying to combat it, but it seems as if we are not going to be able to do much until we contain it. If you enter that village, I cannot allow you to leave. At least, not until we have a handle on a cure. If you come any farther, you will be forced to stay. Forced to stay with a woman as alluringly beautiful as you? That honestly doesn't sound much like a sacrifice. She almost told him to cut it out, but then his large hand curled around her wrist, pulling her close. She could smell his unique scent again, and for some insane reason, she simply wanted to lean into him instead of pulling away. Meet me here tomorrow night, after it has come on full darkness, he murmured. I want to see you again. She started to demur. There were a million reasons why she shouldn't. She would likely be exhausted tomorrow, and getting rest was important. Hell, depending upon how bad things were, she might find herself still working. No one really got a lot of rest at camp, not when they were fighting such a progressive disease. Instead of listening to her arguments, though, Noah backed her against a tree. She was startled by how easy it was for him to simply push her back, and then his mouth came down over hers tenderly but possessively. There was absolutely no warning for it. In another place, with any other man, she would have been furious, but with this one, she simply wrapped her arms around him, tilting her mouth up to be kissed. There was absolutely nothing right about this. It was ludicrous to be kissed by an absolute stranger in the darkness of the African jungle, someone whose last name she didn't even know. What the hell was he even doing out here anyway? It was terrible and terrifying and dangerous, and God, she couldn't remember the last time she had felt this good. Noah's kiss had started out sweet and gentle. There was nothing demanding about it. He only kissed her tenderly, teasing her lips apart with the very tip of his tongue. She whimpered as his tongue found its way into her mouth, touching her own with something almost reverent. He held her as if she was breakable and precious. Stephanie had never experienced being held quite so carefully yet possessively before. Unexpectedly, she clung to him, not wanting any of this to stop. He was so large, and now that she was close to him, she could feel the power of his body as well. There was something perfect about the way she fit into his arms. She felt safe and protected, and daring all at once, and it gave her a surge of exploratory need. At first, Stephanie had been content to simply let him kiss her. It was pleasurable and carefree to be in his arms and kissed like that. But soon enough, she wanted more. She dug her nails into his shoulders lightly, and she nipped his tongue with her own sharp teeth. He almost drew back for a moment, making a noise of surprise, and then he chuckled. "Feisty little one," he murmured approvingly, and she grinned as she pressed herself more firmly against him. She could feel his big body responding to her, and there was something amazing about that as well. They had called her plain when she was younger, and some of her lovers had even called her frigid, but she certainly didn't feel frigid right now. Right now, in Noah's arms, she felt as if she was being shaped by fire, turned molten in his embrace. With the tree at her back and Noah in front, she was effectively trapped, but at that moment, Stephanie felt anything but trapped. She felt as if she were flying, rising above it all to soar high in Noah's arms. She could feel his body tremble with need for her, and she could feel his erection pressed against her stomach. "Do you know how irresistible you are?" He growled, a deep, low thrum in his throat. She raised her eyes to his, and then she froze. In the darkness, for just an instant, she had seen twin glints of gold. The strangeness of it brought her up short, washing the heat back from her for a moment, and she stared. "Your eyes!" The illusion, or whatever it was, disappeared, and it was only a human man looking down at her. Anything else would have been foolishness, certainly. "My eyes?" Noah asked, the voice of reason, and she shook her head. Nothing. I've been very tired lately. I think I need to get some rest before things start up again this morning." "Is that your way of telling me to get lost?" Noah asked with some humor, and Stephanie made a face. "Look, I don't know what you're doing out here, or what brings you to this country in the first place. I'm pretty sure that for my own legal protection and my own sanity, I don't want to know what it is you're doing here. And, if I'm being honest, for your own health, you shouldn't be here either. This illness, I've not seen anything like it before. It could be devastating." To her surprise, Noah chuckled. "Oh, it won't do anything to me," he said cryptically. But then he straightened up, touching her cheek gently with one hand. "All right, we'll play by your rules. I'll let you off here, but only if you agree to meet me back at this very spot tomorrow night." She sputtered a little at that. It was the same request he had made earlier, this time phrased as a bargain. She should be pissed off that he was being so insistent, so much like a man who was used to getting nothing but his way. But something about his smile made her warm to his demand. Stephanie wavered for a moment, but in the end she nodded. She wanted to see him again, and things would not be expected to get so bad in the next 24 hours. It was the days after that she was truly worried about. But for now, wonder of wonders, she could push the thought away. "All right," she said. "Here, tomorrow, if I can. I warn you though, if people need me, I'll be with them, not running around in the woods with you doing whatever it is you have in mind." His grin grew white and sharp. "Well, I have many things in mind, but I'll keep them to myself for now," he said with a smirk. Then, until tomorrow, beautiful. "I'm not beautiful," she started to say automatically, but somehow he had disappeared. She stared around herself, startled. She had known some excellent hunters and trackers in her time in Tanzania and Nairobi, but she was not sure she had seen anyone who could do what this man had just done. "I'm not beautiful," she repeated, but then she heard a soft chuckle not far away. That chuckle seemed to disagree. Stephanie told herself that she had no more time to waste. The sky would be light in a few hours, and when that happened, she needed to be ready to work. Still, she couldn't resist looking back over her shoulder on the walk back to camp. She wondered what Noah looked like in broad daylight. She wondered what had brought him to this country, this particular patch of soil. She wondered if he would kiss her again. Chapter 3. The next day was a living hell. There was no longer any doubt in her mind that there was something deadly stalking the people of the village, and she knew damned well how little they could do about it. At the moment, the spread of the disease was controlled, but that still meant that it was active in their small population. 4 people had died, and 3 more were struck with the illness, and though fast medical intervention could slow the stages of the disease, they had found nothing as of yet that could stop it in its tracks. Stephanie and her staff worked tirelessly to make progress. Stephanie wanted more than anything to be comforting her patients, to try to help them with this terrible affliction. But she knew that that was not her place. Leave that to Jessica, who looked startlingly hollow-eyed this morning, or one of the other young doctors. She herself needed to be taking notes, ruling out treatment courses, and, of course, making sure that up-to-date dispatches still reached the capital and the WHO. If worse came to worse and they lost everyone in the region, that information might be vital for those farther afield to make sense of it all. Stephanie worked with the charts and the results and the data tables until she thought that her eyes were going to cross. She only ate when someone appeared from the mess tent with a bowl of soup and a small sandwich. By the time she looked up from her work, it was dark, and she could hear the night noise of the camp start up. For a moment, she closed her eyes and listened to the sound of the camp. It was more subdued as people talked about the situation they were in. And again, Stephanie wanted to go out to them. For just a few minutes, she wanted to be a face in the crowd, and not the one on whom this all depended. She knew that was impossible, though. At least it was here in camp. Noah had been in the back of her mind all day. If she just closed her eyes, she could imagine his hands on her shoulders, pushing her back against the tree until she was pinioned. She could remember the way he loomed over her and how he bent his head down to press his lips against hers. In her memory, he flamed as bright as the sun. If she were smart, more importantly, if she were wise, Stephanie knew that she wouldn't go back into the jungle. She would stay in her tent, and she would get whatever restless sleep she could manage before the next day came. That was part of the problem, Stephanie supposed. The next day always came. There would always be another day when she was called upon to be the arbiter of life and death. And no matter what happened, it would never, ever end. Sometimes it was enough to drive her crazy. Before Stephanie knew what she was doing, she was walking away from camp. More than that, she was walking quietly and stealthily. When she might have crossed paths with another medic or a villager, she stayed very still. She didn't think that she was hiding, exactly. But there was a part of her that knew very well what she was doing. She wanted to make sure that no one distracted her from her meeting. It was downright dangerous. She still knew nothing about the stranger, no matter how much her body insisted otherwise. She had no idea who he truly was. He could have been a mercenary or a spy. It was common enough in this remote location. He could have been playing a long game, getting her away from camp for a human trafficking operation. It had been known to happen. Stephanie had always thought that her mind was very clever when it came to considering all the angles. Others called her paranoid, but for her own part, she liked to think that she was merely cautious. She barely recognized herself right now. She was being reckless. It was as if the wild Tanzanian night had touched her with its own savage, untamed heartbeat. Stephanie found her way to the tree quickly and without being seen. Once there, she looked around, and when she saw no one about, she felt herself deflate. Wrapping her arms around her body, she stood with her back to the tree. The night was coming on fast, and the sky above was shading to black. Oh God, what the hell is wrong with me? She thought desperately. What kind of fool am I? I am too goddamn old to be chasing around in the jungle after what? A fling? Some of that schoolgirl romance crap they feed us? Nevertheless, she waited. Soon enough, it became clear that she was alone in the woods. She did her best to ignore the pain deep inside her, the tight band around her chest. So she had been stood up. So what? It was bad enough that she was out here. If she had the smarts they gave her credit for, she would be grateful that there was no one here to keep her from getting back to the camp. Stephanie started back, and then to her shock, a dark shadow dropped down on the path in front of her. For a single wild moment, she thought she saw the silhouette of a lion on the path. But then it straightened, and she realized it was none other than Noah. "I am sorry I was a little late," he said with a charming smile. "My friend needed my help with something. Were you getting ready to leave already?" For some reason, His deep and rumbling voice made her heart beat a little faster. She turned her face away, blushing a little. "I'm not a woman who waits around for men," she said stiffly. I've got far too much to do to play games." "Ah, but believe me, I am not playing games," Noah said, and there was something in his voice that made her believe him. "I am telling the truth, and once again, I offer my apologies." He didn't rush over his lateness or try to smooth it over. He simply tendered his apology and waited to see if she would accept it. For some reason, that made her feel oddly forgiving, and she nodded. "All right, apology accepted," she said, and in the last bit of light from the sky, she saw him grin, his teeth straight and sharp. "Good," he said. "I don't think I would like it very much if you were angry with me." I don't want to be angry with you," she responded, because it was true. God, she was so tired of being angry, so tired of having to be in charge of everything. With Noah, however, shedding thoughts of her responsibilities proved to be simple. "Then will you take my hand?" he asked, and hesitant, she placed her small hand in his large one. The moment she touched him, Stephanie was aware again of the energy that flowed between them. It was hot, like the flow of magma beneath the earth, pregnant with a kind of passion that Stephanie dared not name. "You can feel it too, then," Noah said, pleased, and he led her into the jungle. They walked in silence for a short while, and though Stephanie was enjoying the walk under the cooling trees, she broke the silence. "What is it?" she asked, her voice tense and almost afraid. "What is it that I can feel?" Noah chuckled, squeezing her hand a little. It occurred to her how large his hand was, and how hard. She could feel calluses along his palms and on his fingers. A Texas girl, she recognized them as calluses from handling reins and handling guns. Who was this man? I would think that there are as many names for it, probably as many names as there are cultures in the world. But I would simply call it a connection. There is something in you that calls to me, and vice versa. It says that we recognize each other, that we crave each other. Stephanie whimpered a little at the word crave, but she stifled it quickly. She could feel a part of her agree wholeheartedly with his assessment. She could feel the truth in his words the moment he spoke them. That's not a rational answer, though. Stephanie forced herself to say, That's pheromones, or some primitive attraction, like realizing we're from different gene pools and will have stronger children because of it. It's not a real thing." Noah shot her an amused look. "Spoken like a true woman of science," he said. "However, one of my good friends is a scientist of sorts. He would tell you that the first thing a scientist does is admit that there are some things that cannot be explained." "True enough," Stephanie returned. "But that doesn't mean we simply agree to believe what ancient fire eaters and thunder worshippers said. If we did, we'd still be running around in the desert eating raw meat and having virgin sacrifices." "I don't think I've ever had a great deal of use for virgins myself," Noah said mildly. "When I have my choice, I tend to prefer a mature woman, one who knows what she likes and knows how to get it." Stephanie found herself blushing at his soft words. Was it possible she saw him glance in her direction when he said them? That a pink tongue tip flickered out to wet his lips? Surely not. She followed him into the forest, and it took her a while before she realized that they were no longer on a path that she recognized. Where are we?" she asked, her voice trembling a little. Noah turned to her, a challenging expression on his face. "What's the matter, Stephanie? Losing your nerve?" There was something warm under the taunting, but Stephanie put up her chin at his words. She had graduated at the top of her class from medical school, and she hadn't fought her way to her current position by not being bold. "I just need to know if this is a place I would need to shoot you for taking me." Stephanie responded coolly, and Noah burst into a rolling laugh. The sound was loud and booming, but somehow it blended in with the noise of the jungle. There was something about this man that told her that he belonged in wild places. "You know, I believe you would have the guts to shoot me," he said, and there was an admiring note in his voice. "And no, you're not going to shoot me for this. Just a little farther. I promise you'll be pleased." Stephanie sighed, but the truth was that there was a flutter of excitement in her belly that she hadn't enjoyed for quite some time. The only surprises in her line of work were bad ones or worse ones. The idea of a pleasant surprise made her ache suddenly. There had been so little joy in her life these last few years. Was the tide about to change? The path that they were on sloped up so subtly that she never noticed it. In the dark, she might have been afraid of twisting an ankle or getting an injury even more dire. However, Noah helped her over the rough terrain, guiding her around stones and unevenness in the ground while barely seeming to miss a beat. "How the hell are you doing this?" Stephanie finally asked as he guided her around a nearly invisible route across their path. Once she was over it, she could see how heavy it was. If she had tripped over it, she might have gone flying. Noah hesitated for a moment, and when he answered, there was something smooth and practiced about it. "I have camped out here off and on for some years," he said. "I know this area very well." "No one can know it that well," she retorted, but she let it go. The truth was that she was too curious now to stop, no matter what red flags were waved in front of her. Stephanie was simply following Noah, not expecting anything sudden. But then all at once, they stepped out from under the trees. Stephanie gasped, her hands flying up to her face. "Oh my God, it's beautiful," she whispered. They hadn't climbed so very far, but it made a difference. From the medical tents in the village, the stars were very bright, but the artificial lights could blot out most of the details. They had climbed up onto one of the hills nearby, and though she could clearly make out the village a short distance away, she was far more enthralled by the sky that arched above her. This far from the world, she could see the Milky Way, a broad band of white across the deep blue. The moon was rising, and she saw it as a broad golden coin that might be flipped from hand to hand. She could hear the lonely cry of a bird from the forest below, and spontaneously, she turned around to throw her arms around Noah. He staggered a little in surprise, but then his arms came around her. "It seemed like something you needed," he said. "You are a human doctor, surrounded all your days with the living and the dying. I thought perhaps you might wish to come out here, where we can touch the eternal." "The eternal," she murmured, gazing up at the thousands of stars. Some of them she could see, but others faded away in the soft glow of stars beyond. Some of those stars might be long dead after sending their light into the cosmos, but still their light had traveled a universe away to shine on her. "They are not forever," Noah said, looping his arms comfortably around her from behind. "But they are the closest that we can come, I think." "Very poetic," she said with a smile. He sat down on the ground with his back to a large stone planted in the ground. She came closer when he gestured her close, aware that there was a slight wariness in her expression. She was not sure that she altogether trusted this man yet, but she knew she wanted to. The people who knew her would have been shocked, but it was true. This man made trust a prize somehow. "Come here and sit on my lap," he said, patting a thigh for emphasis. "The ground is uncomfortable, and you will like this better." Stephanie reminded herself again that she had not known this man for very long at all. But in this strange place and time, it felt as if everything was permitted. She stepped closer, and gingerly she lowered herself down on his lap. She might have sat there stiffly, but Noah snorted. "I think we're past that, don't you?" he asked. She started to ask what he meant, but then his powerful arms went around her and pulled her snug against his chest. In this position, he seemed enormous, supporting her weight as if she was nothing more than a rabbit or a bird. When she started to protest that she was far too heavy for that, he only chuckled. "Shush, and look up," he said. With a soft sigh, she leaned against him and gazed up at the stars. "Sometimes I come out here and think," Noah said softly. "This is Africa, where the vibrant beat of life began, and sometimes I think I can feel the echo of that creation magic here, just a little bit of it, still lingering in the sweet air." There was a cadence to his speech that lulled her. She could feel the rumble of his chest as he spoke as much as she could hear the sound of his words. She wasn't sure why, but there was something in her that knew that he did not speak like this often, if at all. Whether he knew it or not, he was giving her a gift, and she felt strangely blessed. "And sometimes it humbles me, and sometimes it makes me wild. I want to run and shout over the plains, hunt and fight. There is something primal about this place that calls me, that always has. I have wandered all over the world, and though there is great beauty out there, I believe I will always return to Tanzania. All my life I've felt rootless," Stephanie said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I was born in Texas. I went to school. I did my residency in Florida, and then I started bouncing around with the WHO. We have a mission to help where we can, to try and prevent the spread of disaster." "Is it enough?" Noah asked her, and her breath caught, because it was a question that she asked herself frequently. She was doing good work, but was she truly fulfilled? Some days it felt as if she was barely maintaining an even keel, barely holding back the chaos of disease. "I want it to be," she murmured, and she was shocked by how small her voice sounded. Noah didn't laugh at her. Instead, he ran one enormous hand up and down her back, massaging her gently. "You save lives," he rumbled. "You are doing something worthwhile, but some people would prefer to be happy." "There are some who would say that one person giving up their happiness would be worth hundreds getting to live," she retorted, and Noah turned her around in his lap so that he could meet her eyes. "Perhaps they should ask the person giving up their happiness what they think about that," he said with a glint of humor in his eye, and she couldn't really argue with that. "Can I tell you a story?" he asked, and slightly mystified, she nodded. He dragged her close into his arms and then pointed up at the sky. "If you follow that pointing tree branch up, you are going to see a cluster of 4 stars. Follow the uppermost star straight up, and you'll see a pair of bright white stars very close to one another. Do you see them?" It took Stephanie only a moment before she located the stars he was talking about. They were a bright pair in the sky full of bright stars, but once she saw them, they could not be missed. They were so close they were nearly one. The local people have a legend about those 2 stars. I heard it many years ago, and it has always stayed with me. It must have stayed with them as well, because I was told that the story goes back thousands of years. Once, there was a beautiful young woman by the name Kaya. She was a great king's daughter, and the rivers of the land were given over to her keeping. Because her magic was so strong, she made the rivers run deep and fast, and so the land prospered. "There's always a but," Stephanie said darkly, and Noah chuckled. Of course there was. She was powerful and beautiful, yet her father and her people worried because she had no man. There was no one who could match such a woman, and it would have been a shame to marry her to a man who did not deserve her. "Ah, the old too good for them all dilemma," Stephanie said. Noah nodded. More or less. She didn't mind so much. She had her work, and she had her family. She might have been without a husband all her life, and she supposed that that would not be so bad. However, and here's that but you were thinking about. One day, she was walking along her favorite river, following it far north into the mountains. When she was walking amidst the gray peaks, she met a man unlike any she had ever seen before. His skin was the flat black of obsidian, where hers was a deep brown, and where her hair hung to her waist in 1,000 delicate braids, his hair was shaved altogether. Moreover, she could tell that this man was powerful, and she asked him who he was. He made himself known to her as the master of the mountains, who occasionally made the mountains dance for his amusement, which is where we get earthquakes from. He was the one who reached up to gather moonlight and to sprinkle it on top of the mountains all white and cold. His name was Dak, and she had never seen anyone so beautiful. As will happen, the two powerful people fell in love, and soon enough the entire world knew it. The mountains danced so that even the plains shook. The rivers ran so fast that they overflowed their banks. I suppose you can guess what they were doing. Noah added with a small laugh, squeezing her a little more tightly in his arms. Stephanie would not have considered herself very shy about much, but something about the way that Noah said that made her blush to the roots of her hair. Of course, their people became angry with what they were doing, but they could not stop. The passion had taken them so powerfully that they could do nothing but love one another. Finally, they were seized. They had done so much damage because of their passion that they were exiled. They were thrown up to the sky, sitting in front of their own fires and never to touch again. Those stars, that's where they sit to this day. "Oh, how terrible," Stephanie said, resisting the urge to hide her face in Noah's shoulder. She hated the idea of two lovers being separated like that, never to touch, never to feel each other again, even if they had made the rivers flood and the mountains dance. Noah rubbed her back comfortingly, as if she was a child distressed by a frightening dream. "Well, the thing about fires is that they go out," he continued. "As long as the fires burn, Dak and Kaya must sit gazing upon one another." But the ancient people quickly realized that those stars are not always visible. These days, we know that something revolves across Earth's sky to break up our line of sight for those particular stars. I looked it up once. So on days when their fires are out, Kaya and Dak are together again. Those days, this area is prone to floods and earthquakes, or so it is said. And you know the lovers are together again. Stephanie was silent a long time, and when she spoke again, she sighed a little. "Is it strange that I hoped that it was worth it?" she asked. "I know that earthquakes and floods kill people, destroy the land. But for a passion like that? What would a passion like that be?" "It must be a very grand thing indeed," Noah said, and he laid a gentle kiss on her forehead. Chapter 4. They stayed upon the rise for hours, and afterward, Stephanie could barely remember what they talked about. There was something timeless about that night, and it felt as if she told him everything there was to tell. She told him about her childhood in Texas, about how wild and lonely it had been. She told him about med school and other solid things, but other things were hazier. Somehow, Noah teased out things she hadn't even thought she had known. He learned about how desperately sad she was during medical school, how it felt as if the only thing she had going for her was her smarts. She talked about the other residents falling into a cycle of hookups and breakups throughout the 4 years, and how she had looked at that and realized that it was really the last thing in the world she wanted for herself. "I don't know," she said finally, standing up. "I feel like I came all the way to Tanzania to find out who I really am. And I still don't know." Noah looked at her with some surprise. "How strange," he marveled. "I feel like I know who you are." Stephanie raised an eyebrow. "And who am I exactly?" she asked. "A beautiful, passionate woman who could make the rivers run their banks if she wished to," he said with a smile. "A woman who could make a man move the mountains." Stephanie laughed, not hurt, not flattered, but genuinely disbelieving. "I thought you were listening when I spoke, but were you gazing at the stars instead? I'm pretty sure that anyone listening to my little stories would know that they weren't really about a woman who was in any way passionate." "I disagree," said Noah, and instead of arguing with her, he drew her in for a kiss. Oh, Stephanie thought, and then she lost herself to the desire that whirled around her. This kiss was even more potent than the one from the night before. This one grabbed her up like a whirlwind, whipping her up into the air and not letting her get her feet again. She felt as if she was being blown far off course, and that the only thing that mattered was Noah, and hanging on to him. He was the only stable point in all of this, and she clung to him. She tilted her face up to kiss him more thoroughly, and she found him plundering her mouth. His tongue slipped halfway between her lips, drew back, then plunged in again, and she gasped. She was clinging to him, digging her nails into his impossibly broad shoulders. She could feel his muscles bunch before he bent slightly. He scooped her up with his hands under her thighs, and then she was pinned against a tree again, held in place while he took his time kissing her. "God, the way you make me feel." Noah growled, and there was that strange trick of the light again, the one that turned his eyes to gold. This time, she couldn't bear to stop him. Instead, she tangled her hands in his long hair and dragged him in for another kiss. It was only when he slid his hand down her thigh that Stephanie managed to awaken from her stupor. "No," she whispered, and Noah froze. "Stop?" he asked, his breath ragged. Something inside her warmed at the idea that he was so attuned to her needs. If she had told him to stop, she knew that he would have, something that she didn't expect from all men. "No, just not here. Not out in the open." She wasn't sure where to go. Her own tent was in the center of camp. And if she brought a handsome stranger back to share it with her, it would have been scandalous, not to mention dangerous to Noah because of the quarantine. Noah was nodding, however. "I will take you back to my place," he said. "It's not far." He swiftly led her into the jungle, and less than 15 minutes later, they came to a camp that was cunningly hidden in a grove of trees. Someone could have passed within 10 feet of it and not seen it there. There was a tent, a raised larder for food, a fire pit, and various pieces of equipment around. But Noah and Stephanie only cared about the tent. "You sure this is what you want?" Noah asked, and this close to him, he seemed enormous, far too large for the world, let alone a tent. Yes, Stephanie breathed. "I have never been more certain about anything in my life." The tent was large enough to stand in, and there was a narrow cot at one end. Stephanie started for the cot, but Noah stopped her. "Wait, let me..." In confusion, she allowed him to turn her so that she was facing him. Instead of kissing her again, however, he reached for her clothes. For such a large man, he had a gentle touch. He removed her clothes with the utmost care, as if he were revealing something precious. Each garment was laid over the chair next to the tent flap. He worked diligently, pausing every few moments to kiss a patch of revealed skin or to nuzzle her belly. It came to Stephanie somehow that he was learning her, getting her scent and reveling in it. If someone had described it to her, she might have found it vaguely off-putting. But right now, with Noah's breath tickling her body and his warm mouth raising goosebumps all over her skin, she couldn't resist moaning out loud. The sound that Noah made when she moaned was somewhere between a laugh and a needy groan. "God, and you think you are not a passionate woman," he said, shaking his head. "I want to see you naked as well," she said, surprising herself with her own boldness. "Please." Noah paused for a moment, and then quickly and efficiently he stripped himself to the skin. There was no shyness or hesitation. In the darkness, she could somehow still sense him, sense the shape and bulk of him as she ran her hands blindly along his body. There was something wonderful about learning about him like this. She needed to feel him under her hands. She lifted one hand to trace along his jaw, and when the pads of her fingers touched his lips, she could feel how warm his breath was. Stephanie gasped when he drew her fingers into his mouth, suckling on them gently. She had kissed him, but this was something different. There was a savage sensuality to the way he sucked on her fingers, and even with that simple contact, she felt as if she might faint. He pulled back with a soft laugh that was nearly a growl. And then she was the one yelping as he swept her up in his arms. He carried her the few steps to the bed, and then he laid her down on it, his movements surprisingly tender. "It should be a king-sized bed in the finest hotel in Johannesburg," he said regretfully. "It will be someday, but for now, this will have to do." She started to say that it didn't matter to her at all, but then he came down on top of her, his weight crushing her pleasantly into the mattress as he held himself up on his elbows. She hissed with pleasure as she felt him on top of her. There was something ridiculously sensual about having her skin against the skin of this man, this near stranger who seemed to know her better than anyone else did. She could feel the differences in their bodies, and it only made her hotter. Where she was smooth and soft, he was hairy and hard. Where she was small, he seemed large enough to fill the sky. However, the differences only aroused her further. And acting on some ancient instinct, she lifted her legs and slid them along his hips and thighs. The motion made Noah growl above her, and he pressed his face into the crook of her neck. "God, you have no idea what you do to me," he said, and then he was kissing his way down her body. He traced a line of pure liquid fire down her throat and then to her breasts. She had a moment to worry that her curves were too scant for this man, who could surely have as many women as he wanted. But then he was sucking at one taut nipple while working the other one with his fingertips, and she didn't give a good goddamn. All that mattered was that he continued touching her, using his body to make her feel good. Between licks and kisses, he was murmuring soft words that made chills run up and down her spine when she heard them. He was calling her beautiful, sexy, perfect, and the words opened up something in her soul that she had longed for so long. She realized in a hazy way that she had always wanted to be seen, and now, in this strange place and time, this man was seeing her. "I want to devour you." He groaned, and when his fingers found her soft entrance, she might have let him do just that. Stephanie was usually shyer about letting her lovers do this, but his skilled fingers accepted no shyness or reticence. He slid his fingertips along her slit until she was moaning and wet. He periodically slid his fingertips just inside her entrance, but he didn't press them in until she was whimpering on the cot, her hands fisting by her sides, her head tossing to and fro on the flat pillow. "Oh, please, I need you," Stephanie whispered, and she was only answered by a soft chuckle. "You might think that you do," he said. "Believe me, you don't yet." He dragged the wetness of her entrance up to her clit, and she gasped as electricity shot through her body. The sensations were so powerful that she almost wanted to tear away from him, but it felt so good that she knew that she couldn't do that. Instead, she held herself still, and as his strokes became more assured, her legs fell open. She thought of how she must look spread open on his bed like this, wild and desperate for his touch, but she couldn't stop herself from whimpering his name over and over again. "No, you're blessedly perfect, but you are not ready yet." "Then make me ready," she cried finally, because if she could gain the relief he promised her with every stroke of his fingers, she thought that she might break down and weep. It was as if Noah had been waiting for her words. In a moment, he had dragged her down so that her feet were on the floor. His hands were hooked under her knees, spreading them apart, and he was kissing his way up her thigh as if he were voracious with need. Stephanie had just a moment to brace herself for what he was doing, and then his mouth was between her legs, laving the most sensitive parts of her with a tongue that felt too skilled to be real. The time for teasing was past, apparently, and Noah's lips and tongue and teeth drove her up and up until she was clawing at his bare shoulders, tugging at his mane of thick, soft hair. "Oh God, oh God," she cried. "Please, please, I need you, please." With one savage stroke of his tongue, the pleasure skyrocketed through her body. She threw her head back, her hair whipping across her face like fronds of seaweed in a storm. Her back arched hard, and she knew that she was shouting because she could hear the echo of her voice through the camp. She was electrified with a kind of pleasure that she had never felt before, and it raked over her body in waves, making her shudder over and over again. It was not until she relaxed that Noah stood up. For a moment, he looked down on her as if he were some god that had touched her with a hell-bent need for him. Then he came down on her again, nearly cocooning her. She wondered for a moment that the cot didn't break underneath him, and then he was pressing a knee between her legs, spreading her open. She gave a moment to think of a condom, but then he was kissing her again. He was too hot, too good to allow for any kind of thought, and throwing caution to the winds, she started kissing him again. She could taste herself on him, and that excited her all over again, in a way that she didn't expect. "Oh, God." She groaned when she felt his hard cock pressed intimately against her. "God, how big are you?" She could more sense than see Noah grinning above her. "I will be so slow, so careful with you, perfect one." He murmured, and she knew that in that moment, she had no choice but to surrender to him. Everything inside her was telling her that this was the man she needed, the one that she had always needed. Willingly, she parted her legs for him, and this time, it was his turn to groan. He didn't take her right away. Instead, he slid his cock along her slit teasingly, coating it in her wetness, making her shiver at the last sparks of her climax died inside her. When she felt the blunt tip of his member pressed against her, she had a moment of awe. She could feel how big he was, and for a moment, she almost tensed up. Then he gave her a kiss that was more gentle than sensual, and she knew that he would never force anything. He slid inside her slowly, pausing every few seconds to give her time to adjust. She needed it. It had been some time since her last lover, and he wasn't nearly as large. It felt almost as if she was being impaled for a moment, and then there was nothing but pleasure as he pushed fully inside her. She gasped a little, her head dropping back on the pillow. But there was a low pulse of pleasure deep inside her that made her sigh with bliss. Stephanie? Stephanie, are you all right? Yes, she whispered. Oh, yes. She could feel the moment when Noah's control started to break. His movements became less assured, less steady. There was a stutter to it, and she could hear his breath grow harsh and fast. He dipped his head down, burying it in the crook of her neck before biting her lightly there. God, what I wouldn't give to bite you as hard as I want to. He growled, and though there was a part of her that said clearly how much she wanted that, she held still. Something about the way he spoke awoke a deep longing in her, one that she couldn't quite understand. Stephanie thought that after her explosive climax from before, she would be spent, but to her shock, as Noah's movements quickened, she could feel herself rise again. Her body was rising up to meet his, her mouth opened in a string of long cries, and that passion that never seemed to go dormant between them awakened again, making her cry out. She held on to him as tightly as she could, meeting his eager thrusts. All that mattered was his powerful body pushing into hers and her own frenzied response to him. She was lost in a hot, red place where they were the only two things that mattered. Everything else faded away into the distance, and she could finally breathe. Noah's words had faded off until they were only a deep growl, and she could feel the vibrations all the way through her. He moved over her as if she were a piece of territory he was claiming, and she groaned with need and desperation. Please, please, she heard herself say. I need you so much, so much. He grabbed onto her tightly, and then he was thrusting into her even harder. She felt as if she might break apart, and then eyes wide, her body finally gave in. The pleasure lit her up like a lantern, shaking, wailing. She clung to him as she swelled into a climax. With a deep roar of approval, Noah thrust into her one last time. She could feel the warm, wet life he pushed inside her. Just one more mark of his passion. As a doctor, Stephanie knew that she should be worried about that. But right now, all that mattered was the pleasure that was pulsing between them. She could feel his body trembling for a moment before he collapsed on her, making her groan. Noah lay over her for several long minutes, kissing her neck lazily. They were both recovering from their climaxes, and in that moment, Stephanie could feel herself utterly content. It was a strange feeling for a woman who had spent her entire life chasing one goal or another. She felt as if some missing puzzle piece had fallen into place. Finally, Noah rolled off her with a groan. Do you have any idea how very special you are, Stephanie? He said softly. Stephanie had always thought that her name was rather plain, but now there was something beautiful about it. When Noah said it, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction and joy. I'm not very special at all, she said, curling under his arm. I just like to think that I'm good at what I do. Well, I can certainly say that you are good at what you do." He chuckled. He gathered her close to him. There was not a great deal of space on the cot, but if they both lay on their sides, it worked out well enough. "I really shouldn't stay," Stephanie murmured. "I need to be at work in the morning. There are a few solutions that we are chasing." "Hush," Noah said firmly. "You can get some rest before going back. If you don't, there are too many serious things that could go wrong." She might have tried to argue with him if she didn't realize that he was absolutely right. There had been so many things going wrong lately, and if she did not get some time away from them, she was going to go utterly insane. She was in a tent in the jungle with a man whose last name she didn't know. She had just had sex with a near stranger. At the very least, she should have been panicked and afraid. However, as she lay in Noah's arms, all that mattered was that she finally, somehow, felt at peace. That was the most important thing to her right that second. And in a matter of moments, she had drifted off to sleep. Chapter 5. Stephanie blinked awake, looking around with bemusement. The pale morning light coming through the canvas of the tent told her that it was past dawn, but she knew that it was still early yet. There was still a heavy, warm weight leaning against her back, and she could feel Noah's breath tickle the hair behind her ears. It made her smile, and for a moment, she simply lay in place, feeling all these sensations with her eyes closed. It felt so good to lie in one place, to assume for a time that her every decision wasn't a matter of life and death. Moving slowly so that she didn't disturb her lover, she twisted around in Noah's embrace until she was facing his sleeping face. In the light, she realized now that his hair was a gorgeous gold. It fell slightly past his shoulders, and when she stroked it lightly, he purred in his sleep. Enchanted, she twisted a few slippery strands between her fingers, letting it coil away when she loosened her grip. She had felt how soft his hair was last night, but this was the first time she really registered the satiny silkiness of it. She blinked when she realized that for all his stillness, Noah was watching her through half-lidded eyes. In the light of day, she could see that his eyes were a peculiar shade of light brown, so light in fact that they looked like honey. "Oh, but you're beautiful," she whispered, and he chuckled a little. "That's encouraging," he said. "How are you feeling this morning?" "Good," Stephanie said with a grin. "Better than I ever have, and thank you for that." She knew what needed to come next. No matter how much joy they had had of each other, she needed to return to camp. She had a job to do, and the sooner she got to it, the better it would be for all. However, she was so at peace lying naked on the cot with Noah by her side that she was loath to rise. She simply felt so content, folded in his arms, basking in the warmth of his honey smile. Noah seemed to sense her thoughts. Instead of getting up, however, he looped one arm around her and buried his face in her hair. The act struck her as primal, and she remembered how he had tasted her everywhere last night. There was something proprietary about the way he nuzzled her, and she blushed a little before pushing at him. "I really should be getting back, though," she said, honest regret in her voice. "I have so much work to do, and today we might be going until we drop." Noah certainly heard her, but for the moment, he didn't look as if he were paying any attention at all. "It can wait. It can all wait," he murmured, his mouth dropping down to her collarbones. "It can wait for the esteemed doctor for just a little bit, can it?" Stephanie gasped softly as his mouth dropped down to her pert breasts. "Oh, God." "A few hours won't make a huge difference at all," he coaxed. Enough time to lie in bed with me for a bit? For me to feed you? Those are worthwhile activities, aren't they? Damn him. But he was making as good a case with his touch as he was with his words. Everywhere he touched her, whether it was with his hand, his thighs, his slowly stiffening member, or his mouth, she felt a resurgence of that fire that he had lit the night before. He was branding her body with need, and right now, that was all she cared about. Noah. She meant to scold, but his name came out as a long and drawn-out sigh instead. Shush. Let me handle things for a little while, he murmured. I will make you feel so good, so good. Stephanie wasn't sure what enchantment came over her when she gave in to his soft words and even softer touch. She needed what he was offering her, and if that meant that she shut the world out for a little bit, perhaps that wasn't such a bad thing, was it? She was about to be well and truly lost to his desire when Noah, who had pushed himself over her, froze. She watched in awe as a man who was nothing but lazy sensuality turned into a sort of war machine. Noah? Shush, he said, sliding off her. His feet hit the ground nearly soundlessly, but he didn't reach for his clothes at all. She wondered what in the world it was, but then she heard it too. There was a scuffling outside, something that was too large to be the scavengers, rodents, or monkeys that sometimes came in and trashed unwary camps. Noah's face was locked in a mask of cold fury and betrayal, and suddenly there wasn't a man standing there, but instead an enormous gold lion. Stephanie inhaled the sharp breath. The reality was too much. She thought that she would faint dead away. It couldn't be happening. It was too unbelievable. And then the lion roared with rage, making the entire tent echo with its fury. In a matter of moments, the ferocious animal tore its way out of the tent, as if the canvas was butter, raging into the clearing to destroy whatever foe was trespassing into its territory. My God, he's so beautiful, Stephanie thought, and then reality reasserted itself. People didn't turn into lions. Noah isn't a lion. What the hell was going on? As she watched, the lion stared around the clearing, tensed and furious. She could see how he longed to fight, how the claws on his forepaws rolled out of their sheaths reflexively. Stephanie guessed that the lion's head would be level with her shoulder if she stood up. Suddenly, the lion's body language relaxed, and Stephanie could see beyond him to figure out what had set off that primal display. Over the lion's shoulder, she could see a tall man with dark hair, dressed in the khaki outfit that so many men in the bush wore. Despite the enormous predator currently staring him down, the man looked unimpressed, even a little amused. I think this is a bit much, don't you? I was just trying to score some breakfast. For a moment, Stephanie was sure that real life was about to reassert itself. This man was going to die as an enormous lion mauled him, and then the lion would turn around and maul her to death as well. As she died, she would wonder what the hell had happened to Noah. All of this flashed through Stephanie's mind in a split second, and then the lion snorted, a deep and irritated sound. The lion seemed to shrink down inside itself, and then there was Noah, standing naked, golden, and unashamed in the early morning sunlight. Stephanie stared at him, and even as her brain tried to put together what it had seen, it occurred to her that there really was something stunningly beautiful about this man, something otherworldly, something perfect. Then she realized that her first impulse had been right after all, and she lurched to her feet, pointing a shaking finger at him. You were a lion! she said, her voice deeply shocked. "What the hell? You were a lion!" In nearly any other circumstances, the look of chagrin on Noah's face might have been funny. He winced a little, and then he frowned slightly at her. She had no idea what was going on until he stepped forward, ignoring the wreckage of his tent. He folded her in his arms, and for a moment, she was so stunned and confused that she allowed him to do so. Then she pushed him away, still shaking, her eyes wide. "I might be going into shock," a cold and clinical voice announced in her head, but she ignored it. Are you a witch?" she demanded. "I've been in Tanzania for 6 years, and they've always told tales of witches that could take on animal forms. God, I never believed them, but this, what else could you be?" Her voice was high and thin. She felt as if she were spinning through space, pinwheeling back and forth. As what had happened set in deeper, there was no telling how far she might have fallen if Noah hadn't stepped forward, pulling her into his arms. She might have fought him again, but this time she was so shaken that she merely allowed it. "Oh God," she whimpered, and he stroked her hair gently. "Like Adam and Eve," she said after a moment, and he pulled back slightly to look at her. From the look of concern on his face, she guessed he was worried that she had cracked under the pressure. She struggled to get a better grip on it. "Like in the Bible," she said with a soft giggle. "We're naked together, and it's so beautiful here in Eden." She took several deep breaths and pushed him away. In the back of her mind, there was still a dark-haired younger man somewhere behind Noah. But it mattered less than this. "All right, whatever just happened, I want an explanation," she said presently. For a moment, Noah simply stared at her, and then he laughed, the sound as golden and round as she remembered it. He shook his head and reached for a blanket that had slid off the cot. "You deserve an explanation," he said, "but first, put this on. I don't want this fool getting more of an eyeful than he already has." He gestured back to the man that had set off all the ruckus. In the middle of all this, he had simply dug into the supplies and pulled out some rations to chew on while they got things settled. When he turned towards her, she could see that his eyes were bright and curious, friendly despite their strange circumstances. "Best do as he says," the stranger agreed. "He's the one in charge after all." It was earlier than Stephanie had thought it was. She decided that she had time to sit and eat with the odd duo before anyone noticed that she was missing from camp. But more importantly, she wanted her explanation. When both she and Noah were clothed at last, they sat at the cold fire pit with the man who introduced himself as Marcus. As they ate their rations, Noah explained. "You've seen something that you were not meant to have seen," he said, and there was a peculiar heaviness to his tone. "Your kind aren't meant to know that there are shifters in the world." "My kind?" she echoed. "I'm a human. Are you telling me that you're not?" Noah and Marcus exchanged a look that she couldn't read, and Noah shrugged. "We don't know," he said. "All we know is that we are shifters. We are people who change at will into animals. There are not many of us, and so far as our histories have it, we have always walked beside you, though on a more moonlit path rather than sunlit." Stephanie's mind whirled. The scope of history and secrecy that he was talking about was monumental. But how can that be? I know people, and I know how good they are at keeping secrets. Surely something like this should have slipped through the cracks. Are you telling me that there's some kind of kind of conspiracy that is keeping you all a secret? Noah scowled, and she wondered if she had touched on a sensitive spot. There are measures that are taken to keep us secret and safe, he said, his tone heavy. Believe me, Stephanie, when I say that we have no interest in spending our lives locked in cages as scientists try to figure out what makes us what we are. We have advanced and progressed just as you have, and we have ways of keeping ourselves secret. He means mind wipes, Marcus said, a little too cheerfully for Stephanie's taste. If you are not one of us, or if you do not work for the council, there's a good chance that you stand to have your memory wiped. It's a mostly simple procedure, but it is not without its risks. Some of the people the mind wipe is performed upon are never the same. Noah made a sound that was somewhat akin to a growl, and Marcus immediately backed off. It was clear what he meant when he had said that Noah was the one in charge of this camp. But that's not what I want for you, Noah said hurriedly. God, not for you. This was an accident. You seeing what you did. It does not have to go further than this, especially if you swear not to speak of it. Stephanie looked at Noah's face in surprise. There was a strange fear there, and after a moment, she realized that it was not a fear for his secret or his people. It was a fear for her. You don't want me to get mind wiped, she murmured, and he nodded tersely. It is a terrible thing to have a blank space where something good once resided, he said bluntly. I would not want to lose you that way. You would trust me with a secret like this? She asked. Noah looked torn for a moment, and with a flash of insight, she thought she could understand. If the organization that Noah and Marcus worked for, the council that they referred to, had trained them up, he would of course think that it was a traitorous thing to go against them in any way. To her surprise, and to her gratitude, he nodded. I do. He murmured, I do trust you. I would stake my life on it. Noah looked miserable at the idea, and to Stephanie's surprise, it was Marcus who spoke. Now do you understand? He asked. And Noah growled slightly, but he nodded. She wondered what that meant, but then Noah turned to him. I'm taking Stephanie back to camp now. Pack up. We're leaving before noon. Aye, aye, Captain, Marcus said with some amusement, but he didn't say anything else as she and Noah stood to leave. They walked for most of the way in silence, and then he turned to her. Absently, she noticed that they were standing close to the tree where they had shared their first kiss in the moonlight. God, it was so recent, but so much had changed since then. The very world around her had altered, and she wasn't sure that she knew exactly what was true now. I'm sorry to be leaving you, he said, and she was shocked at the genuine regret in his voice. I don't want to do that. She looked at him in surprise. In the shade of the trees, in the unsteady shadows of the waving leaves, his shape was indistinct for a moment, as if at any moment he might turn back into that golden lion that she had briefly watched with such awe. They stared into each other's eyes, and in that moment, Stephanie felt more connected to him than she had while they were locked in a passionate embrace. Without thinking, she reached up to caress his cheek gently. Noah leaned into her touch. I don't want to leave you, he repeated, and she let go of a breath she had been holding. She had wanted to hear those words for a very long time, but it felt so raw that she had to push it away. We've only known each other for 2 days, she said. Not even that. I never expected more from you. The smile he gave her was slightly pained, and he pulled her into his arms. I'm sorry for that, he growled, kissing her gently. The kiss was sweet, almost chaste, but it still had the effect of lighting something deep within her on fire. "Why?" she asked, trying to keep her voice light. "Would it have pleased you to hear that I was going to hang on to your memory for years, as I kept myself pure for you, or something?" Noah pulled back, and this time there was something deadly serious in his gaze. "This isn't a game. At least it isn't to me. When we met, Stephanie, I felt something for you. Something I had not felt before." "When we met?" she asked, her voice strained. "Yes. I saw you in the jungle, and at first I was worried. I had no idea what a woman was doing there so late, all by herself. I followed you because I was worried. I only intended to shadow you, to protect you. But you made that impossible." He bowed his head for a moment, and when he spoke again, there was a rumble in his voice, as if the beast side of him was very near the surface. "I couldn't leave you alone," he said. "No matter how foolish it was, I had to make myself known to you. There is something in you that calls to me, Stephanie." She found herself nodding mutely. She did understand. She might not have wanted to, but there was something in her that recognized Noah as well. The idea of him leaving wrenched her heart as if it would tear in two, but she had to ignore it. "What does this mean for us?" she asked. She was a little startled to use the word us. It felt too intimate, too strange for a man that she had known for less than a week. But it was the only word that made any sense in that situation. There was something tying her to Noah, and it would be foolish to deny it. Noah paused, and then it was as if he had come to a decision. "This is more information that you have to keep quiet," he said with a sigh. "Marcus and I are in Tanzania on a mission. There have been reports of an artifact that belongs to the Shifter Council, one that was believed to be lost hundreds of years ago. Now, we believe that we might have found it again." She blinked at the explanation, because whatever she had been expecting, it was not that. Like you're Indiana Jones?" A stray smile flickered across Noah's full lips. "A bit like that. If the artifacts that Indiana Jones recovered were vital to the security of his world, I suppose. This artifact, it is one that cannot fall into enemy hands. We need to retrieve it. Believe me, if this were any less dire, I would call the council and tell them that I was taking myself off the mission, that there were things more important." Stephanie couldn't stop herself from nuzzling his hand when he stroked her cheek gently. It was hard to believe that this was all happening, that Noah was saying these things, but a part of her already believed him. She had known that there was something mysterious about him, something profoundly special when he had first appeared out of the darkness. This only confirmed it. "I can't. But what I can say is that I will come back for you. I swear. There is something between us that I cannot forsake, that I will not lose. Do you understand?" He gazed down at her with eyes like molten gold, and Stephanie found herself nodding. "I understand. I hope you return." "I will," he said fiercely. "But I've been left before. In the end, there's only me. I thank you for the promise, but I will believe it when I see it." The look he gave her was terrible indeed, and she could feel his powerful hands flex where they rested on her shoulders. For a moment, Stephanie wondered if she should be afraid, and then his mouth crashed down on hers. When Noah kissed her, it did not convince her mind that he would return. However, it felt as if that desperate, wild kiss unlocked something in her body. Her mind resisted, but her body and heart seemed convinced of another truth. His kiss left her reeling, and for a moment, she had to hang on to him, her world spinning wildly around her. "I will come back for you," he said softly. Noah brushed a lock of hair away from her forehead. The gesture was unexpectedly tender for a man who could turn into an enormous lion. "Believe me." Then he turned and was gone. She saw him step off the trail, and his silence was so absolute, so perfect, that he immediately disappeared. A part of her told herself that she would never see him again. But it felt as if somehow Noah had lit something inside her, a lamp that would burn until he came back. Stephanie turned back towards the camp. The moment she set foot in it, there were people running towards her. Things had gotten worse, decisions needed to be made, lives were being lost. Stephanie took a deep breath and bit back the instinct to scream. She had no answers, not now. She had little more information than what the rest of the staff did, but she was expected to shoulder the responsibility of saving every life that she could. It was a burden that someone had to take on, but in that moment, a part of her wanted to leave, to go to a life where she could simply be oblivious to the pain in the world. Then she breathed, and when she reached inside herself, she found a little bit of the peace that Noah had created in her. In his arms, she had found something so beautiful that it soothed her even now. "All right, people," she said out loud. "Let's get to work." Chapter 6. 4 weeks later, Marnie Arbinger, a renowned hematologist from the CDC, arrived like the answer to a prayer. She appeared with a thoroughly chastened bush pilot who was known for giving female medics and doctors alike problems, and Stephanie had to admit that she was impressed. Still, though, it was hard to really take the girl seriously. She was young and blonde, delicately beautiful in a way that Stephanie had never been. She knew that there was no such thing as a beauty contest when lives were at stake. She left Marnie to start her work with Jessica since the two were friends, and it was Jessica's pull that had brought Marnie out to Tanzania. Dr. Arbinger provided some much-needed aid, but it was really a scant comfort to Stephanie. That afternoon, Stephanie found herself angrier with the idea of the new doctor than anything else, and her anger brought her to a dead stop. "What the hell is wrong with me?" she wondered. Her hands paused as she rifled through the paperwork that was part and parcel of running any organization of this size. She was, for once, mercifully alone in the trailer that served as her administrative center, and she could pause to think about what was going on with herself. "God, I've been terrible lately," she thought with a little regret. She had been snappish with her staff, and though some of it could be attributed to the strain of the disease they were fighting, not all of it was. She thought of how tired she had been and how very sore. Her glance dropped to the paperwork, which contained today's date, and her eyes widened. No, there's no way," she said out loud. They were not set up as a women's health center, but they had many of the tools that one might need. Somehow, Stephanie smuggled the pregnancy kit into the communal toilets, and in less than 5 minutes, she had her answer. "Oh, dear Lord," she murmured, looking at the double line. She was pregnant. Somehow, despite her birth control, she was pregnant, and the world dipped around her. The scientific part of her brain told her that it was an absolute possibility after what had passed between her and Noah. But the rest of her simply reeled. When she managed to find her footing again mentally, one thought stood out from the rest. "I am going to have a baby." She locked herself in the administrative trailer, stunned and trying to process her emotions. The first feeling that surfaced was fear. She knew how vulnerable pregnant women could be to disease, and right now, she was surrounded by one of the worst epidemics she had ever seen. They were losing more people to the strange sickness every day, and almost subconsciously, her hand spread over her flat stomach. She glanced down at it in dismay. It was hard to believe that there was a life inside her, something that her body would fight to nurture and to protect. Still, it was there, and she felt a fierce surge of maternal affection. She was going to be a mother. Of course, the question was what she would be a mother to. For the first time, she thought of Noah's transformation with a shiver. He had talked about his kind living among humans for thousands of years. But did they breed true? Would her child be completely human? Or would it have Noah's powers? Would a child be able to perform the transformation that Noah had? Or would it be stuck? Stephanie's breath caught at the idea of her child being born a mix of baby and cub, something stuck between forms, suffering and dying, and she being unable to help it. She could feel a panic start to set in, but Stephanie took a deep breath and refused to allow it to consume her. She was running a camp that was doing its best to save people against all the odds. She had come to Tanzania to battle the specter of disease. She would not give in so easily to unfounded fears. She told herself that she was a doctor. She could monitor the pregnancy carefully, and she had at least 8 months to figure everything out. With one hand cradled over her belly, she thought about what needed to happen. One thought came through loud and clear. She needed to find Noah. He needed to be told. 2 days later, everything kicked into high gear. First, 2 men entered the camp. One of them was Marcus, though he seemed to have his hands too full with Dr. Delaney to greet her. He had some kind of love affair going with Jessica, though neither of them seemed very happy about it. It occurred to Stephanie that he, then, was the lover that she had been hiding. The second man? Stephanie learned much later that he was named Jax, and he was ripped to ribbons. She was certain when Dr. Arbinger took him to the operating room that her efforts would be wasted and he would die. But somehow, he was up and moving around less than 12 hours later, albeit gingerly. Something about the man reminded her of Noah, and it occurred to her that rapid healing was certainly something that could be a shifter trait. At the moment, Jack seemed glued to Marnie, and so Stephanie let it go for the time being. It was around that time when the illness, already fast and deadly, seemed to kick into high gear. Suddenly, the time between contraction and death shortened, and the panic was rising both in the medical camp and in the village. It meant that Stephanie had to impose the iron ruling that she had been resisting for some time. Complete quarantine. She told her stone-faced staff. No one in, no one out. Her staff were skilled, and they worked tirelessly to convey her orders to the village, and to provide comfort and aid where they could. At this point, however, there was perishingly little they could do. There was nothing that could be done against the disease's fast spread, and Stephanie began to wonder if she was going to die here, if they were all going to die here. At the height of the illness, when Stephanie hadn't slept in almost 30 hours, Jax came to her. It struck her in a dull sort of way that he was surprisingly handsome, even as she realized that it was only a slight resemblance to Noah that made him so. What I'm going to tell you will shock you. He began, and she lanced him with a sharp gaze. You're a shifter? She asked, and she had the satisfaction of watching him rear back in surprise. Yes, he said after a moment. How do you... I know what Marcus is, and I know Noah as well. I was wondering if you were the same. I am, he said. But listen, There's going to be an attack. There's a troop of hyena shifters coming here soon." She listened with increasing shock as he described the attack that was imminent. The idea of 2 men fending off an attack of that size seemed ludicrous, but Jax appeared confident enough. She supposed that if a man who had been on death's door the night before was confident about such a thing, she would have to trust him. "All right then. I'll bring my people back as far from the plane as possible. Then I'll come back. I know my way around a rifle well enough." Jax looked startled at her steely gaze. "You can't be serious. You're a healer." "When people try to hurt those I am healing, I turn into something else," she responded shortly. "Now tell me if we can find Noah. I can't imagine that he would shy away from this fight." Jack shook his head firmly. "He is following another lead. The council set him on a trail to the south, and he's been out of contact for some time. I have a way that may work in getting through to him, but that's something for emergencies only." "Would it make a difference if you knew that I was carrying his child?" Stephanie wondered, but she pushed the thought away. "All right," she said instead. After that, Stephanie was consumed with the terrifying task of trying to move both healthy and sick as far into the rear of the settlement as possible. The people were afraid and shocked, but with some prodding and some shouting, she got them where they needed to be. Once she had gotten them stationed, she went to find her own rifle. The last thing she wanted was to be a target, so looking around, she decided on an aerial perch. This was going to be a battle of blood and fang, she knew, and that meant that she would have to worry far less about being a target above. With a grunt, she climbed on top of one of the trailers. They looked like normal hyenas. That was one of the first things she noticed. The hyena was an animal she had become quite familiar with in her sojourns throughout Africa. She had always thought they were fearsome animals, but she respected their tenacity and their will to survive. For a moment, she had a twinge about the idea of shooting them. That was something that poachers did. Then Stephanie narrowed her eyes and really saw the way they moved. They didn't travel in a rambling pack, playing and herding what cubs there were. Instead, they moved in a wedge-shaped formation, moving quickly and with a sense of purpose that she could only call military. It was shocking to see, and in that moment, she realized beyond a shadow of a doubt that there was no way these animals were truly animals. There was a real human intelligence behind the animal bodies. However, a part of her still doubted that until, some 20 yards from the camp proper, they started a dead run. It was a hunting behavior, she knew. One that they executed when there was a prey in sight. There was no doubt about it now. They were attacking, and Stephanie gritted her teeth. One last shot, she thought. She fired the rifle over their heads, a loud report that seemed to shake the world apart. The hyenas shied away, but as she suspected they would do, they swarmed back into place, never wavering from their attack. Stephanie felt her mind clear. She wasn't a killer. She was, first and foremost, a healer, and there were people in her care. She needed to make sure that the people she was protecting were safe, and these hyenas represented a clear and present danger to them. It had been a while since she had shot. Her first few missed, but then her third shot took one attacking hyena down just as it was about to clamp jaws on the hind foot of the tiger that had thrown itself into the mix. The hyena fell back into the grass and turned into a man at the moment of death. Stephanie registered the transformation as well as the tiger's startled look in her direction, but she was already sighting another shot, taking aim, pulling the trigger. She fell into a rhythm, pausing only to reload. Her motions were unhurried because she had been taught that it was far better to be slow than clumsy. She was in a clear and silent place where everything had its own time. Her mind drifted once or twice to the baby that slept inside her, to the lion man whose presence she desperately longed for, but otherwise, it was perfectly quiet inside her head. The entire battle likely took less than an hour, but it was strange to Stephanie. After a short while, it felt as if she had done nothing but lie on top of the trailer, shooting the things that had come to hurt her patients. In her memory, however, it felt as if it was all over in a mere minute. She was still in that haze when a terrible thumping shook the entire trailer. Stephanie cried out, clinging instinctively to the trailer she was on, and if the rifle hadn't been on a strap around her body, it would have gone right over the edge. The second thump shook the trailer, and she realized that this was no accident. Staying as steady as she could, she crawled on her belly over to the side where the thumping was coming from. There were 2 large hyenas rushing the trailer. They had realized the tool that she was training on their kinsman, and it looked like they were determined to take her out. This close, she could smell their fur. See the way froth sprayed from their powerful jaws. Those jaws could snap a springbok's leg in 2, she knew, and suddenly, all she could think about were those teeth digging into her flesh. Stephanie gritted her teeth to stop them from chattering, and then she reached for her rifle. When she was taking aim again, however, they rammed the trailer, nearly shaking her off of it. She couldn't steady herself for a clear shot, not when every time she tried, the entire structure shook underneath her. She could feel the first tendrils of panic winding up towards her heart and her mind. But then rescue appeared in the form of an enormous tiger and a panther as dark as a midnight shadow. They swarmed the 2 hyenas as if they had a personal grudge against them, and Stephanie, despite being inured to the violence she had just seen, had to look away as the enemy were dispatched with 2 enormous snaps. As she watched, the Black Panther turned into Marcus. The man was utterly naked and covered with gore, but he did not pay any mind to it as he called to her. "Are you all right? Can you come down?" She was, and she could. She slithered down a little more roughly than she had climbed up, but when she stood in front of the 2 shifter warriors, she could feel herself steady. "Is that it? Is it over?" she asked. Marcus nodded as Jack simply turned and sprinted away, towards the place where the non-combatants were being kept safe. Stephanie felt her throat close with fear. "What is it? What's—" Marcus shook his head. "The hyenas are dead. We can count on that. Jax has other things on his mind." Chapter 7. The other thing turned out to be poor Dr. Marnie Arbinger, struck down with the disease that had taken so many others. When she and Marcus finally found them, Jax had the small blonde cradled in his arms, his green eyes glassy and staring. Just from looking at the girl in his arms, Stephanie knew that she was near the end. Jax, you must let her go," she said softly. "She's still alive," Jax insisted. She's going to be fine." Stephanie exchanged a glance with Marcus, who had come with her. They both knew that that wasn't true. "Come, bring her here. We can make her more comfortable at least." It was the least they could do for the doctor who had worked so hard for them for such a short while. She might regain consciousness again at some point, and that was not something that she was prepared to take from Jax if it happened. Once they had gotten Marnie settled, Stephanie went about her business, getting the camp back in order, trying to make sure that the people she could take care of got what they needed. Somewhere in there, Jessica found her and made her take some water and food, but the young doctor could not make her take a rest. "I need to keep going," Stephanie said, and then she hesitated. "If I don't, I'm afraid that I'll drop and not be able to get back up for a month." "If anyone deserves that, it's you," Jessica said with a slight smile and a shake of her head, but she left well enough alone. That was something at least. It was some time later when she heard a scream of anguish echoing over the camp. Stephanie had heard many such screams over the course of her career, but this was the first one that was tinged with the roar of a tiger. Damn, he lost her. Stephanie muttered, and she took off running for the trailer where they had left Jax and Marnie. She found the shifter on the ground, kneeling next to the bed. He clutched one of Marnie's still, cold hands in his, and for a short while, Stephanie was afraid that he would refuse to let her go. She had to keep a hand on his shoulder to prevent him from charging the people who came to zip his lover into a body bag, and then they were alone. I'm taking her back to Chicago, he said suddenly, standing up. I can't leave her here. I can't let her rot here. This place killed her. I cannot let you take her from this place, Stephanie said, but she knew it was grief and not reason that she was talking to. And I'm telling you that you can't stop me, Jax said, taking a step towards her. It would have been terrifying if Stephanie had had the energy left in her to feel terrified. As it was, she simply stared at him, refusing to get out of his way. No. I suppose if you decided in all your testosterone-fueled male grief and rage that you had to pick up her poor body and throw it over your shoulder, there would be little I could do. Jax's growl would have sent demons back to hell, but Stephanie was convinced that she was living in her own private hell right now. And you would be responsible for spreading this damn disease wherever you took her, Stephanie continued. You want to take her home? That means taking her through an international airport, Jax. That means exposing an entire traveling population to germs that might still be very viable. Where are all those people going? You're going to the United States, which, let's be honest, doesn't always move as fast as it should when it comes to epidemics. What about the people who are going to major population centers like London or Beijing? The people who are going to small rural homes where there's no professional medical help for miles? You may very well be dooming them to what is happening here, something that Marnie herself would never abide. It was a low blow, but Stephanie didn't think that anything else would reach the man in his grief. At the moment, she didn't mind fighting dirty. When Jack still looked unconvinced, she pulled out one last card, the only one she had still to play. I think you know. We have a friend in common. Jax's head shot up, and then he took a more speculative look at her. Stephanie found herself wondering if he thought that she was too plain by far for a man like Noah, and she told herself that that was not something she should be thinking about right now. He's not under anyone's control, she continued, but I think I could convince him to see my side of things. Don't you? It was a calculated bid. She had seen Jax in his tiger form, and it was magnificent, but she thought that Noah would be larger still, even stronger. She had no idea if the threat of Noah would bring Jax in line, but Jax finally nodded. It was not fear that had made him back down, but respect. You fight dirty, Doctor, he said, but there was a hint of understanding in his voice that hadn't been there before. Stephanie smiled slightly, letting some of the relief that she felt dribble through. That's me using whatever I have at my disposal to keep the world safe, Jax. I swear to you, Marnie's remains will be taken care of. They will not be handled disrespectfully, and we will use them to learn what we can in order to quell this disease. I swear to you. I may not have known her that well or for that long, but I am familiar with her work. As another female in this profession, I know that this is what she would have wanted. Jack sighed, standing up. I know. I know you are right, and this is the only thing that makes the idea bearable. Thank you. I need to get out of here. He said, "I can't survive this. I'm not a problem. As soon as I am packed, I'll be leaving. I can't stand this." Stephanie was mostly certain he was right. Shifter physiology was different from that of humans, given the quick healing and the sudden transformations. However, even if she wanted to, she couldn't think of a way to stop him. For a moment, Stephanie simply stood in the quiet trailer, aware of Marnie's body in a way that she hadn't been when Jax was there with her. Something in her mind insisted that Marnie was listening, and she shook her head. She was going crazy. This job, this grief, were all driving her crazy, not to mention the unexpected pregnancy. "What the hell are we going to do?" she asked softly, and then she left Marnie to rest. She had work to do. Chapter 8. When Jessica came to tell her that Marnie was alive, Stephanie was so exhausted that it seemed like one more impossibility added to the pile. The girl who had been dead was alive, and she had a cure for the disease. In her mind, Stephanie was privately calling it a plague, and thanks to Marnie's insight, they had realized it was exactly that. It was an ancient disease that humanity had never learned to heal from. Somehow it had disappeared for perhaps hundreds of years. An ancient plague needed an ancient solution, and that was where the shifters came in. Their physiology somehow knew how to fight the disease, and a transfusion of blood from Jax, the miraculous universal donor, saw the people who had been afflicted were well on their way to health. When Stephanie asked Marnie how she had figured it out, the girl had stuttered and Stephanie had let her off the hook. It was fairly obvious anyway, and Stephanie had no interest in embarrassing her. At some point, finally, after all of the inoculations had been seen to, and after Jax had been given plenty of liquids to replenish his blood supply and to keep him healthy, Stephanie collapsed in her tiny bed. She was asleep as soon as her head hit the pillow, and it seemed to her later that it was dreadfully unfair that she had to deal with nightmares on top of everything else. She firmly felt that if you spent the day fighting shifter hyenas, that you should be allowed to sleep without any interruptions. In her dreams, she carried a carefully swaddled baby in her arms. Sometimes, it made sad, mewling noises, but she didn't have the time to comfort it the way that she ached to. Instead, she had to keep looking for Noah. Noah could protect them. Noah could help them. When he appeared, however, he looked at her with disdain. In that moment, she knew that she could never hope to compare to a shifter woman, to any woman. He took the baby from her arms. When she saw her baby clearly, she saw that he had a lion cub's face. Noah took their child with him, and she knew that she would never see either again. She was left crying in the mist, and there was nothing she could do about it. She came awake with a start, telling herself that it was all a dream. Her hand stole over her belly, and despite all the doubt and fear in her mind, one certainty came out of it. "I will not let him take you from me," she whispered. "I won't." She was not unsurprised when Jessica and Marnie decided to leave with the two shifter men afterward. Stephanie supported their decision. There were rumors of a similar illness along their route of travel, and with enough synthesized cure, they could stop the terror before it got a foothold in another village. Before they left, however, Stephanie cornered Marcus. "Tell me," she said, "where is Noah? Are you going to be going to him?" Marcus shook his head. "He's still in the south as far as I know," he said. "Council business." There was a shut-off quality to his speech that told her that he could not tell her more even if he wanted to, and Stephanie nodded in defeat. "Thank you," she said. "Perhaps if you see him before I do, you can tell him that I want to speak with him. It is urgent." She had no intention of telling Marcus what that urgency might be, but then he grasped her wrist as she turned around. His eyes were wide, His nose twitched as he sniffed the air, and he looked slightly stunned. "You're pregnant," he exclaimed, and she glared at him. "Keep your voice down," Stephanie hissed. "And yes." "Is it Noah's?" She shot him a withering look. "Do you think I have had time to fool around while all this has been going on?" Marcus held up his hands defensively. "Yes, all right, that was dumb of me. But a child between a human and a shifter?" "Is it rare?" asked Stephanie, suddenly nervous. "Are there deformities or illnesses?" "Rare, yes. A little. But no illnesses," Marcus said. "But Noah? Noah needs to know." Stephanie nodded tightly. The relief at his words, however, was great. "He does, and I will tell him as soon as I can." When she saw Marcus, Jessica, Marnie, and Jax hike off into the forest, Stephanie felt a great yearning inside her. She was not a woman who believed in fate or in destiny, but if she was, she had an idea that this was what it would feel like. A germ of an idea sprouted in her mind, and she hurried back to her trailer to plan. The idea was mad to say the least, but as soon as she had conceived of it, she knew that it was the only route open to her. Marcus fought with himself for 2 days. The process that he was thinking about was only for emergencies, and the council would certainly say that this was far from being an emergency. However, the council was in Naples, and Noah had done far more for him than the damn council ever had. 2 nights after they had left the medical camp, when Jax and Marnie were out on a hunt, Jax had called it, but Marcus suspected that he was actually interested in getting some time alone with his chosen mate. He pulled a bag of purple powder out of his gear. "What's that?" asked Jessica, looking on curiously. For a moment, Marcus thought about what it might be like if she were the one pregnant, and he was in South Africa, not knowing that anything was going on at all. That made his decision for him, and he grinned at her. "This, fierce Jessica, is something that I'm probably not supposed to do." He dropped a handful of the purple powder into the fire. A plume of pale lavender smoke shot up into the air, and after a moment, an image of Noah's face could be seen. The older shifter looked at Marcus, eyes dark. "Marcus, what the hell is going on? Are things going south?" "Not at all," Marcus responded. "The situation with the artifact I'm carrying is well on its way to being resolved, and Jessica's traveling with me now. So, far less chance that you'll make everyone in near proximity want to kill you. Good," said Noah, nodding sagely. It was well known that shifters without their chosen mates wavered between difficult to get along and downright murderous, and Marcus winced at some of his own behaviors before he could bring Jessica with him. For her part, she merely snickered from the shadows, and he shook his head. "No, everything's fine. But Noah, Stephanie's pregnant." If the situation hadn't been so dire, Marcus would have laughed out loud at the look of astonishment on Noah's face. Noah was slightly older than he and Jax were, and the idea of a human shifter pregnancy was rare enough. "That's impossible," Noah said flatly. "It's unlikely, strange and improbable, but far from impossible," Marcus said. "Noah, I smelled her. She's pregnant." Noah's gaze darkened, and if he hadn't been several countries away, Marcus might have been very nervous indeed. As it was, he could see Noah's hands clenching and unclenching, as if he could feel his claws threatening to come out. "All right," Noah said after a moment. "Stay with her. I'll be there as soon as I can." "She's still at camp," Marcus said, because it was better to get all the bad news out of the way at once. "We defeated the hyenas." "Hyenas? There were hyenas in the area?" which we defeated," Marcus said calmly. "And I'll point out that your lady Stephanie had something to do with that. As soon as the battle was joined, she stepped right in, climbed up on the top of a trailer. It made a difference." "She entered battle while pregnant?" Noah demanded, and Marcus and Jessica both winced from his rising tone. Throughout the shifter communities, no one was quite as possessive as a lion, and Marcus thought that probably went double for a lion who had just found out he was about to be a father. "She did, and she survived and thrived," Marcus said, a little testily. "She was completely uninjured, and she was a part of the effort to cure the plague." The only reason that Noah did not explode, Marcus knew, was that he was taking savage control of his own bestial instincts. As it was, his eyes gleamed a leonine gold, and Marcus hid a smile. "All right, stay with her. I'm going to be up we're already 2 days north already," Marcus said, which I was going to say before you got all heated up about the hyenas. "What? Why in the name of 7 hells did you leave her?" Marcus shot Noah a look that was unafraid. "Because she's not helpless, Noah. She is strong and courageous, and she has a job to do. And I should remind you, we have a job to do as well. If we have the chalice, that means that the hyenas, any that may be left, and their allies are going to go after us, not her. That means that in the long run, she'll be safer where she is." Noah had apparently had enough, and no matter how much common sense Marcus was speaking, the idea of his mate and his cub in danger was too much. He changed into his enormous lion form and rushed at them. Jessica, forgetting that the man himself was still in South Africa, shrieked in surprise, but Marcus was ready. He had a bucket of sand nearby, and as soon as Noah leapt, he poured the sand over the fire, causing the fire to wink out and the smoke to dissipate. "What the hell?" gasped Jessica, wide-eyed. "What would have happened if he had made the jump?" "Nothing at all," Marcus said with a shrug. "Just seemed impolite to see him jump into a fire. I'm sure he'll figure it out." Jessica didn't seem so sure. She came to sit next to Marcus, and she held one hand almost speculatively over her belly. "I don't know about that," she mused. "What would you do if you knew that I was pregnant with your child and half a continent away?" "Tear through hell trying to get to you," he said immediately, and then chuckled. "I'm not worried. Stephanie's clever, and when he's not in a rage, Noah is too. They'll be fine. They'll figure it all out." Throughout her life, Stephanie had always been clear on what she needed to do. She might not have liked it, and she might not have acknowledged how difficult her task might be, but she always knew when she needed to get a move on. She could feel the decision nibbling at the back of her mind the next day or so after the shifters and her 2 doctors left. She tried to ignore it, but soon enough, she realized that she couldn't. Instead of ignoring it, she gave in. She made sure that her assistants knew how to both synthesize and administer the cure, and she spoke with her contacts at the WHO so that they had a clear idea of what had happened in their camp. She of course left out the information about the shifters, though she did wonder briefly whether that was necessary. If there had been shifters present throughout human history, surely someone knew about them. It didn't matter. Stephanie was utterly determined when she had set her mind on something. She made sure to pack as much food, and more importantly, water, as she could carry. She had a compass and her satellite phone, which, while signal would be terrible, it might at least offer her some connection to the outside world if she got into trouble. Stephanie hesitated over the rifle. It had served her well, but she genuinely didn't like guns. Finally, she slung it over her back with a sigh. It would be better to have it and not need it than to need it and to come up short. She ignored the tiny voice inside her that was telling her that this was foolishness, that told her that what she was doing was all for a man she would never see again. There was no way for her to get in contact with Noah. She had his promise, but he hadn't known that she was going to be pregnant. He might have meant that he would return in a year or even 2. She couldn't take that risk. She didn't have a phone number, a last name, even a nationality. Her only 2 links to the most exciting man she had ever met were currently marching north, and that meant that that was where she needed to go as well. A week after she had bid Jessica and Marnie an emotional goodbye, she set out on the path herself. The medical camp would function well in her absence. There was nothing there for her at all. She started walking her path. Chapter 9. Stephanie found after the first day that she tired easily. She had to stop almost every hour, wiping the sweat from her face. More than once, settling into a particularly lovely sunbeam, she had thought that she might fall asleep. Stephanie shook her head ruefully. Was this what pregnancy did to you? She wasn't an obstetrician, but she had overseen and assisted at her fair share of births. More than once, she had lifted a beautiful, bloody infant for its mother's first kiss. What would it feel like when she was the one groaning on the table, surrounded by people who were trying to help? There was a part of Stephanie that was guiltily, almost shamefully excited to be getting away from the medical camp. It had been a nightmare for so long. If she thought about it too much, she would start to get shivers and nausea. She suspected that she would feel the effects of being in that place for some time. Post-traumatic stress disorder was insidious. There was even a chance that the chemicals responsible for all that stress could pass on to her child in the womb. "Sorry, kiddo. I'll try to do better for you as we go on together," she said, passing a hand over her stomach. Stephanie realized with a grimace that she was talking to her belly more as time passed. At first, it was because she had no one else to talk to, but at some point, it had turned to a belief that her child could truly hear and understand her, if not take comfort in her voice. She had told other mothers-to-be to talk to their bellies if it helped, but she had never before thought that she would do it. "Sometime soon, we're going to introduce you to your papa," she said as she continued to walk. "And we'll learn all about what you need, and I'll make sure that we give you everything we can. Just so much love, baby." Stephanie didn't know what kind of encouragement her child could take from her words, but she knew that they comforted her, at least. The words kept her going when she wanted to sit down and cry, when a ravine looked too steep, or when the path seemed to peter down to nothing. However, somehow, she always found an extra burst of strength, or her compass was there to show her the way. She might be slowed, but she refused to stop. When the sky was streaking purple towards sunset, she found the camp that Marcus, Jax, Marty, and Jessica had made. It comforted her enormously to realize again that she was on their trail, rather than wandering around in the forest by herself. She made herself a small fire in the blackened pit that they had used, and she ate her rations as night fell. Her walks into the jungle at night were nothing compared to this, and Stephanie shivered. It made her think of the fact that being sent off on one's own in ancient times was the worst punishment possible. Being isolated from one's people, sent off to die, it was like a nightmare. Stephanie wrapped her arms around her, and to fend off the despair, she thought of Noah. She curled up in the sheltering rocks, and the memories returned to her. She could remember his form materializing out of the darkness like a god in the wood. She remembered his smile and the way his eyes glowed gold in the dark. God, she should have been terrified, but she never had been. Not even that fateful morning when she had learned his secret. Stephanie's eyes drifted closed, and she thought of how his body felt nestled against hers. He was so large that it had felt as if he could swallow her whole in his arms. She summoned up his warm breath at the nape of her neck, and then she remembered the way he had touched her. No one had ever brought that pleasure out in her. No one had ever tended to her needs as sweetly. In that moment, Stephanie knew that it didn't matter what she didn't know about him. What mattered was what she did know. She knew that he was brave, that he was passionate. She knew that he would return to her. She knew that he was everything she had ever wanted, and she refused to be denied. As Stephanie drifted off to sleep, she felt as if she had summoned him in truth. She could feel his weight against her back, defending her from everything that might hurt her. She could feel him smile into her hair, dropping soft kisses along her neck as she went to sleep. She could hear his whisper in her ear, and over again, he said, "Soon." When she awoke the next day, Stephanie almost expected to see the man himself, larger than life, golden hair down around his shoulders, and that magnificent, lazy grin on his face. Instead, she was as alone as she had been when she went to bed, and she almost wanted to cry. Of course, she didn't. Instead, Stephanie gathered her things, doused her fire, and chastened herself slightly for allowing the pregnancy hormones to get to her. Taking a deep breath to compose herself, she started off again. "I will find you," she told herself. "I will not stop until I see you again. Noah, don't you know that I need you?" Stephanie marched until she was ready to drop, and then to her relief, she found her way to another camp that had been set by her friends. It was another reminder that she was not simply wandering aimlessly through the jungle, and she started to make camp. "Well, what will it be tonight, little one?" she murmured to her stomach. MREs are offering up Salisbury steak or vegetable stew. She reached for her gear where her food was held, but then she froze. Stephanie had dropped her pack with relief when she entered the campsite, and now there was an enormous snake curled up over it. The snake was at least 10 feet if it was an inch, and its spade-shaped head regarded her with an icy reptilian gaze. "Oh my God," Stephanie whispered softly, and she took one step back, and then another. She didn't know a great deal about snakes, but there was something distinctly poisonous about the way this one was shaped. It looked as if it might strike at any moment. "It's all right," she thought to herself. "Snakes aren't dangerous unless you piss them off. Just wait it out. Keep an eye on it, don't panic, and eventually, it's going to get bored with whatever's in your bag. Then you'll be able to—" A low and sibilant hiss interrupted her thoughts. But it didn't come from in front of her, from the snake on her bag. Instead, it came from behind her, and Stephanie had to bite her tongue to keep from screaming. She spun around, careful not to take a single step backward, and she found the second snake right behind her. If she had taken another 2 steps, she would have stepped on it. This one was rounder than the first, with a snubber nose that she thought meant that it was a constrictor. It was far bigger than the first, however, and it blocked her path. That was when she realized that she was surrounded. There were an even dozen snakes all around her, some on the ground, some in the trees. There were all types, and they were all watching her with an intelligence that she found uncanny. No, not uncanny. Shifter. Stephanie took a deep breath, because there was no situation that would ever be improved by her shrieking out loud, the way she wanted to. "My name is Stephanie Carter," she said, her voice ringing clearly. "I'm not here to hurt you, or to take anything from you. I'm just passing through. I'm trying to find someone important to me." The echo of her words died down, and the only sound remaining was a soft and continuous hiss. The sound never became less ominous or less threatening. For a moment, Stephanie thought that she was wrong. They were not shifters at all. They must be real snakes. Though why such a diverse group would gather and then focus on her, she couldn't say. She was just wondering if they would notice or care at all if she sneaked away, perhaps between the tree and that small boa, when the energy in the clearing changed. As one, the snakes all twisted their heads to look to Stephanie's right, and she gasped. An enormous snake with a body as thick as Stephanie's waist flowed over the ground like water, moving with a speed that should have been impossible. It was the longest snake she had ever seen, and the bands of green and black around its body gave it a singularly sinister look. It was so large that Stephanie thought blankly that it must be an anaconda, the heaviest snake in the world. It came straight towards her, never taking its completely black eyes from her face, and she felt something dark cross over her spirit. To her surprise, the anaconda started to raise itself up, rearing back until its broad head was level with her own, and then taller. It was an enormous, primitive monster, and Stephanie had to resist the urge to simply run. She had an idea how the snake might attack, and when it lunged, it was going to be faster than she was by far. "Oh God, if I stay still, maybe they'll leave me alone," she thought. Then the snake started to transform, and Stephanie felt a moment of disbelief. After all the impossible things she had dealt with in the last few months or so, this was the one that seemed to break her suspension of disbelief. It simply didn't make sense that the snake in front of her could be a shifter. But there it was, and that meant that all the snakes around her were as well, didn't it? The anaconda flexed, writhed for a moment, and where there had been an enormous snake before, now there was a gorgeous woman looking as if she belonged in the Tanzanian jungle as much as the trees and the grass did. She was a little shorter than Stephanie, but far more blush, with wide round hips, a tiny waist, and breasts that were large and round. Her sleek black hair fell down to her waist, and there was a private mischief in her gaze that made her seem warm and loving. Then she grinned at Stephanie, and Stephanie knew right down to the chill in her bones that this woman was her enemy. "Hello, pretty one," the woman said. "You're traveling a long way by yourself, aren't you?" "Not as far as you are," Stephanie said, trying to keep the quaver out of her voice. "I didn't know anacondas ranged as far as Africa." The woman laughed, and it was a beautiful sound. For some reason, though, it made Stephanie's blood run cold. "Oh, I'm less snake than I am woman. My name is Sophie. Shall we be friends?" She offered her slim hand to Stephanie, and Stephanie took it automatically without thinking. Instead of shaking it, however, Sophie grabbed it tightly in hers. Stephanie barely stifled a cry at how it hurt, and then she was being yanked forward. Sophie's face came close to Stephanie's, and for a moment, Stephanie wondered if there was some latent instinct in humans that allowed them to detect shifters. Her panicked brain told her this was not a human who had grabbed her, but a snake, and that she needed to get away, get away, get away. Sophie let her go as if they'd been simply shaking hands, laughing a little. "Oh, I thought so. You reek of shifters, little human woman." "What? What are you going to do with me?" Stephanie asked, hating how her voice trembled. "Well, we have some friends in common," Sophie said, her voice sweet. "Marcus, Jax, and of course, Noah." Noah's name on this woman's lips made Stephanie's hackles rise, and she wondered what in the world could be between these two powerful shifters. I don't know who you mean," Stephanie started, but Sophie frowned, making a cutting motion with her hand. Don't give me that, Sophie said, and suddenly, Stephanie could feel hard coils loop around her ankles, a smart blow being struck against her back. With a cry of dismay, she was dragged down to the ground, stretched out flat on her back by a half-dozen surprisingly powerful snakes. They looped themselves around her arms, her legs, even her neck, pinning her on her back. When she struggled, they only tightened their grip, warning her to stay still. "Oh my God," Stephanie groaned, and Sophie came to stand over her. "I think you'll find that lying to me is a very poor choice," Sophie said, her voice soft. "Don't ever do it again. Do you understand me?" Yes." "Good. I can smell his child in you, you know," Sophie said, kneeling down next to the prone woman. Her hand flattened over Stephanie's belly, and Stephanie thought she had never wanted to maim and kill another creature more. "He left his seed in you, and now you're going to bear his little kitten bastard." There was a flash of something that Stephanie could not read on the anaconda shifter's face, and then it was gone, replaced by a smile that looked barely sane. "I think that will make finding Noah a lot easier for both of us," Sophie cooed. She ran her hand over Stephanie's belly again, with a covetous pride that made the prone woman's head spin. For a moment, she had a vision of Sophie slitting her open, pulling a screaming infant from her body. She banished the image with all the willpower she had, and then she gazed up at Sophie with true fear. "Please," she said, her voice hoarse. "Let me go. I don't know what you are hoping to accomplish, but let me go." Sophie's expression didn't change. If anything, it grew more sadistic. "No, I don't think I'll be doing that. After all, we're traveling in the same direction. We both want the same thing. Let's stick together. I'm sure we'll get what we're looking for much more quickly that way. Don't you?" On some unseen signal, the snakes released Stephanie. The spots where their coils had squeezed her left her feeling bruised. Cautiously, she sat up, rubbing her wrists. She didn't dare look up at Sophie's face. When Sophie touched the top of her head, the gesture almost like something an older sister would do, Stephanie flinched, but refused to acknowledge it. Sophie made a soft tutting sound, and then she fisted her hand in Stephanie's hair, drawing her head back. Stephanie looked up into the other woman's face, wanting to close her eyes, but knowing that she shouldn't. "Get up," Sophie hissed. "We've got a long way to go, and I know humans can walk longer than you have. We have a lot of distance to cover, and the sooner you get off your ass, the sooner I can recover what's mine." Stephanie's thoughts flashed to Noah's mention of uncovering artifacts, and she realized that this woman was one of the dangers he had talked about. "Please." She already knew that begging would not work, but she couldn't help herself. She folded her arms over her belly protectively, flinching when Sophie made to kick her before stopping herself at the last moment. "Get up, or I'll make you wish you had," the anaconda shifter said, and, tears stinging her eyes, Stephanie staggered to her feet. "Oh God, what am I going to do now?" she thought in despair. Sophie shifted down into her snake form, and if Stephanie had any doubts about where to go, she was nipped in the heels, nudged by the enormous snake, or simply hissed at until she made the right move. The sun set slowly towards the horizon, and all around her the jungle went dark. The daylight birds quieted and were replaced with the screams and growls of the hunters and the predators, the ones who came out only at night. For the first time, however, Stephanie had no fear of them. Her fear was reserved entirely for the snakes who slithered by her side, and she walked into the night with terror on her heels. Chapter 10. The snakes were tireless. The only one that she ever saw in human form was Sophie, and Sophie paced her every step, slithering directly behind her. Whenever she turned to look at the other woman, she was chilled by a serpentine smile. Soon, Stephanie began only looking straight in front of her as she walked, one foot in front of the other. She was still on track, following the path that her friends had left behind, but she was resting far less often. The snakes pushed her to walk long into the night, only pausing to allow her sleep for a few blessed hours before dawn. Stephanie would collapse into a heap where she fell, taking desperate refuge in unconsciousness. She curled on the ground, relishing any escape that she could get from the terrible situation that she was in. Her mind had turned blank, any thought long overshadowed by the uproar of her suffering body. Shifters were far more enduring than humans. She could tell that this was just a walk in the park for Sophie, that Sophie was taking a sadistic delight in marching her until she dropped. It was even harder thinking of the baby in her belly. How much harm was she doing to herself as she marched through the sweltering jungle? She knew that miscarriages were incredibly common this early in a pregnancy. And that was when the mother wasn't walking over miles and miles of rough terrain. Stephanie woke in the morning with tears in her eyes. Life had become a dark hell. As the sun was setting on the third day, Stephanie finally dropped to her knees on the trail. Sophie, now walking behind, kicked her lightly on her right leg, and then again, not so lightly. "Why are you stopping?" she said, her voice light and cruel. "There's still a great deal of walking to do. Get up, silly woman." "I can't," Stephanie said, her voice worn down to a whisper. "I can't. I can't. My baby." Sophie laughed. "Your girl is stronger than you are," she said. "She has shifter blood in her. And if a puny human can survive this, she can." It was a strange comfort anyway. In the back of her mind, Stephanie wondered if sensing the gender of a child was something a shifter could simply smell out, the same way Sophie could smell out her pregnancy. Out loud, all she said was, "Please." Sophie's face hardened. "I have not been so close to catching Noah in months, perhaps so long as a year," she said, her voice lowering to a deep hiss. "I have chased him across the continent. Now, when I have him so close, you are telling me you cannot get up? Not acceptable." "I can't," Stephanie insisted. It wasn't quite true, but what was true was that her mind was cracking. She could see it happen as if she was watching her brain shatter from a distance. She had been under such an amount of stress for the past week that she was breaking. "You can," Sophie insisted. But before she could say what measures she would employ to make sure that that happened, there was a deep roar from the jungle behind them. "I think you're about to get what you want," Stephanie said, not moving from where she lay on the ground. The lion that burst out of the underbrush behind them gleamed like the sun, larger and more vicious than anything Stephanie could have imagined. She did not doubt for a moment that it was Noah. She knew it was him, and her heart cried out in joy even as her body begged for relief from the pain. Sophie turned, hissing as she did so. Even though she was a fully naked human woman, there was something snake-like about her motions, as if at any moment she might rear back and strike. "Noah," she said, her voice a parody of affection. "I am so glad to see you." The lion growled, padding forward. The snakes that were closest to him slithered back, their narrow heads flicking from the lion to the naked woman. "We were once friends," Sophie continued. We were once better than friends, don't you recall? We were powerful together, and now we could be powerful again if you would give up the council. Give it all up and come with me again. Sophie's voice was soft as a spring breeze, sweet as honey. Even though she knew firsthand how very vicious the woman could be, Stephanie found herself feeling seduced by it. Surely someone with a voice like that couldn't mean any harm. Surely she would never be as cruel as she had been. Noah knew better, however. He stood growling with his head lowered, the picture of menace. When she took a step closer to him, he struck with all his weight behind it. One enormous paw lashed out, all claws extended, and the shifter woman fell to the ground with a panicked scream. Offer refused was the message sent, and when Sophie came back up, she was all snake, thick coils rolling along the ground as she reared back to strike. Stephanie watched with a hand over her mouth as the snakes attacked and the lion struck back, roaring rage and defiance. The fight was savage. Some of the snake were killed outright, bodies falling to either side. More escaped, slithering off into the forest. Apparently, bullying a human woman was one thing, but battling a full-grown male lion was another. What happened to Sophie? Stephanie didn't know. At last, the lion turned to her, eyes bright gold, and Stephanie felt her body flood with love and relief. She thought that she would start crying or laughing, or both, but in the end, it was too much, and she simply fell over in a dead faint. Stephanie was aware of the passage of time. She had an impression of being held and then being carried. She was strapped to a broad and furry back that seemed as wide as the world, and there were bonds holding her in place so she did not slip. The ground was flying by beneath her, far faster than she could move herself. It was alarming, but it all felt so far away. It felt like something that she needn't worry about. Not really, because she was simply so tired. The whole time, she could hear a voice. It was a voice that she could not give a name to right away, but it was soft and as powerful as a distant storm. Most of the time, it was just a comforting rumble in her ears, but other times, rarely, it modulated into words. Please, please hang on, beautiful love. Hang on. You are mine. You are mine. Do not leave me. She heard the voice, and she marveled at the pain and the desperation in it. If it wasn't for that voice, she might have decided to simply let go. She could feel the urge to give up and to rest. After all, hadn't she been working so hard? Didn't she deserve a rest after all that she had been through? It seemed cruel to keep going, but the voice kept calling her back. For some reason, that voice kept her tethered when nothing else would have. She would stay. She would fight. Perhaps it would not always be terrible grief and pain. Towards the end, she was aware of another voice as well. If the first one was a torrent of gold, this one was a thread, fine and sparkling. There were no words to it at all, only a nameless questioning and yearning. This one wound around her until she glowed, and Stephanie knew that she would never leave them, never leave her family. Stephanie came awake with a start, realizing that water was being dribbled onto her lips. The water was cold and delicious, and she was sitting up for more before she was even awake. As she sat up, she was aware of a million aches and pains that peppered her body, and she gasped. "Careful, careful, beloved." Noah said, "Take it slow." She stared at him, eyes wide. It had been so long since she had seen him that now it felt like a fantasy that he was here with her, touching her, sitting above her with a soft and concerned smile on his face. She brushed the water away with the back of her hand, and half stumbling, half grasping, she made her way into his arms. "Oh, Noah," she whispered. "Oh, Noah, I am so happy to see you." He sighed with peace when she threw her arms around him. He gathered her gently to his chest with a soft sound of pleasure. "My God, I thought I had lost you," he said tenderly. "I can't believe that you were alone all that time. I never want to let you go again." She could have listened to him talk for days, weeks, but then he rested a gentle, calloused hand along her jaw, turning her face towards him. The kiss he gave her made her shiver right down to her toes, and she moaned into his lips. "I have thought about this every night we have been apart," he growled, and she could see a glint of gold in his eyes. She was learning, slowly but surely. There was something wilder to him than there was to Jax or Marcus. Instead of being afraid, she welcomed it. She embraced it. That was the wildness that had drawn her to him. It was that same wildness that had made her love him, she now realized. "Wait, I need to tell you," she started, but he smiled at her. "That you are carrying my child? I know this." She blinked at him, and he held her close. This time, his hand drifted down to her belly, resting on the flat expanse with tenderness. "Marcus revealed as much," he said. "We have ways of making ourselves known to each other, even when we are running wild. As soon as he told me, I tore myself away to come back north to Tanzania." He stretched a little, and now she could see how dusty he was, how very worn. He wore a piece of white cloth wrapped around his hips, like some of the local men. The rest of Noah was bare, and he was covered with small cuts and scrapes, as if he had pulled himself through the underbrush on his hands and knees. "Oh, God, did you run that entire way?" she asked, appalled, and Noah nodded. "It was the fastest way. If I had waited for a bush pilot, it could have taken weeks. There is no way to get a vehicle through most of the terrain that I have crossed." He touched the tip of her nose with one finger, shaking his head. "Believe me when I say that very few people could send me on a run like that one. I crossed most of the country at a dead run for you." She blushed a little, and she couldn't quite hide how much she liked that. He had saved her life, and she felt a deep warmth rising inside her. "I am glad you did," she said, shivering a little. "I don't know how long I might have lasted with the snakes." His face took on a fierce aspect, and for a moment, Stephanie saw Noah as his enemies did, as a ferocious beast capable of merciless annihilation. "They did not suffer nearly enough for what they did to you." He growled with fury. "If I could meet them again—" "But you're here now," Stephanie said, and she had the satisfaction of watching Noah calm down at her gentle touch. "It's fine. I am fine. I also believe that our child is fine." Noah's hand rubbed her belly gently, nodding a little as he did so. "I know she is," he said practically. "She is present, and she is sleeping yet, but she is healthy." Stephanie bit her lip. Is that something you think, or something you know?" He looked at her, slightly surprised. "Something I know," Noah said at last. "I can sense some things, not everything. I know that she is healthy, and that she is likely a girl. But beyond that, I do not know if she is going to be a shifter or not, for example." Is Is there a very great chance of that? That she can do what you do?" Noah grinned at her. "It's about 50-50, he said. "She might be a shifter. She might be all human. But as long as she is as brave and as clever as you are, that's all that I care about. You have a courage worthy of a lion's mate." "Oh? Is that what I am?" she asked, feeling recovered enough to be a bit playful. "The lion's mate?" His eyes lit with a golden fire, and his hands gripped her a little harder. As exhausted and terrified as she had been, Stephanie felt a thrill of passion go through her. During her long march, she had thought of the dozens of things that she wanted to say to Noah when she met him next. But it all faded away in the face of this heat, this need. Something kept her back, though, and even if a part of her ached to be with him again, another part hesitated. "Where are we?" she asked, pulling back from him slightly. Noah looked surprised, but he shrugged. "We are farther north. I wanted to get us to the refuge where Jax, Marcus, and their women are staying while the women tend to the village. It is a safe place, one of the best. But this place is decent enough to stop at." It was astonishingly beautiful, Stephanie realized, looking around. She lay on soft grass under an enormous tree, and just yards away was a secret pool fed by a trickle of water falling from above. It was shaded on every side by rocks, leaving just a narrow passage for someone to enter. Stephanie realized that it was completely protected, especially with someone as powerful as Noah guarding the passage, and she looked at the water longingly. "I feel as if I haven't really been clean in ages," she sighed. For a moment it looked as if Noah was going to ignore her, pulling her into his arms and lying her down on the grass. If he had touched her with his skilled hands, kissed her as she so very much longed to be kissed, she wasn't sure what she would do. However, he only smiled a little and nodded. "Here, let me help you." She blushed when she realized that he was intent on stripping her clothes from her body. He did it with efficiency and care, only stopping to run his palms over her hot skin once or twice. Then he was guiding her into the water, which was shockingly cold. "Oh, my lord, it's frigid!" she exclaimed. "It's fed by mountain runoff," he said. "It will be better once you get in." She let him guide her into the water, and when the first shock of the chill receded, she felt herself let out a breath of relief. "Feels good?" "So good," she said. He hovered close as she cleaned herself thoroughly, relishing the clean water and how good it felt on her skin. He was always within an arm's reach, however, and the whole time, she could feel his eyes on her. "You're watching me," she murmured, and he smiled, the very picture of leonine satisfaction. "You're mine, and I like looking at you," was his return. Stephanie felt herself bridle at that suddenly. "I'm not some teenager who's going to rejoice at the idea of finding someone to claim me and give me worth," she said sternly, and he cocked his head at her. "What a strange thing. I'm the strongest fighter in this part of the world, the man that others look to for leadership. I have defeated every shifter who has run up against me in battle, and what I want, I take. You are mine. That is something to be proud of." He spoke with such conviction that she stared at him. "But surely you don't think that," Stephanie persisted. "I'm a doctor. I have my own accomplishments. I do not take my value just from being your woman." "My mate," he corrected, coming to stand a little closer. "And more than that, You are mine. You are not property, but make no mistake, with my child in your belly and my scent on you, no one will think you anything else." That was how that snake woman found me, she realized, because I smell like you somehow. His face hardened. "If I meet Sophie again, she's dead," he said coldly. "And yes, you are recognizable as mine, yet I failed to protect you. For that, please forgive me. From now on, I will keep you better, take better care of you and our little one." She started to argue with him again. Damn it, but she was independent, had been taking care of herself and others for years. She was a doctor and had recently fended off a hyena attack. She didn't get a chance to argue, however, because he stepped closer. His strong arms gathered her close to him, and he was kissing her, deep and sweet and slow. She could feel the heat shoot through her, looping through Noah's body and coming back to hers. The hard planes of his body meshed with the soft contours of hers. She could feel herself falling. "Catch me," Stephanie murmured. "Oh, catch me, please." Noah groaned low in his throat, and she whimpered as she pressed closer to him. There was no protest in her at all as he swept her up in his arms, pulling her back to the bank. He laid her down in the shade underneath the tree again, and this time, nothing stopped him from devouring her with kisses. Stephanie was on her back, cushioned by the lush, soft grass, and above her sunlight shone through the leaves of the trees. There was a peculiar stillness to the air, as if the world was holding its breath in anticipation of what came next. Then Noah rose over her, blocking it all out again, and she felt as if she had found another sun, something that lit up her world and gave her the warmth that she had always craved. "Mine," he said, his voice little more than a growl. "Mine, mine." She whimpered as his mouth came down to her throat, kissing her there before biting. She knew that he was not even exerting a tenth of his strength as he bit her. The sting was soothed by his tongue immediately thereafter, and he continued, kissing a line down to her small breasts. Her nipples puckered almost painfully sensitive in the air, and she groaned as he palmed them one after the other. "So perfect, and so very beautiful," he crooned, and as he spoke, he raised one thigh so that it parted hers. Instead of pulling back slightly, however, he pressed his thigh up between her naked legs, the hard muscle against the very center of her. He ground against her slowly, and the sensations pulsed through her, making her shake with need. She couldn't believe how easily this man could arouse her, how very much she wanted him. The pressure between her legs was delicious and consuming. It made her wrap her arms around him, clinging hard. The small whimpers and moans that she made slowly modulated themselves into words, and over again she asked for more. "Soon, my beauty," Noah crooned. "Soon." She sobbed at that, because God, it had been so long. She wanted this man, and she wanted him now. But for some reason, he seemed content to make her wait. She rode his thigh shamelessly, and it came to her in an absent sort of way that she was doing this all in broad daylight. Perhaps she would have been embarrassed if this had happened 6 months ago. But since she had met Noah, shame felt like a concept that had nothing to do with her. There was no way she could be ashamed of reveling in her body with this beautiful man. There was no way she could regret hanging on to him as he aroused her, his hot breath against her shoulder and making her need him even more. There was something wild and free about this, something that left no room at all for shame or fear. All that existed in the world was the two of them and she would never, ever regret that. "Oh God, I need you," Stephanie moaned, and with trembling hands, she reached for his cock. It was hard under her questing touch, the skin surprisingly silky. Slowly she circled her fingers around the turgid, velvety head, teasing at the gleaming drop of cloudy liquid that appeared there. She could feel the way that Noah's breath caught at her touch. For a moment, she was worried that she had somehow hurt him or offended him. But then she realized that he was looking at her with a wild and fierce need. Emboldened, she wrapped her hand around the shaft of his cock, drawing her palm along the soft skin there. With every pass of her hand, Noah's breath hissed between his teeth, and he pressed more insistently between her legs. It was like a contest, she thought hazily, a play for dominance where both could win. She needed this man in ways that she didn't even understand yet, and when he dropped his head down to kiss her again, she embraced him tightly. "I can't take much more of this," Noah growled, and she dared to smile up at him, feeling a deep joy bubble through her. "Then don't," she said. "You've kept me waiting for so long. Don't keep me waiting any longer." He held out for a little longer. He continued to arouse her, dropping hot kisses to her neck and her breasts, making her shiver. However, just as he wouldn't stop touching her, she refused to stop touching him. She gave him as good as she got, and she relished every gasp and groan she got out of him. It struck her with a certainty that she would never doubt that he had not had another woman since he had lain with her. She didn't need him to say it. She simply knew. Stephanie realized that she had power over this amazing man, and it thrilled her, raised her high into the stars. Her grip around his cock tightened suddenly, and he threw back his head, his teeth gritted. "What you do to me, woman," he said. She could hear the tremor in his voice, but that was all the warning she got before he drew back. She whimpered at the loss of his comforting bulk over her, but then he was turning her over. She scrambled for purchase, but he was so much stronger than she was. The teasing lover was gone, and in his place was a being of pure need and hunger. It might have frightened Stephanie, but she realized that she was overcome with the same need. She was shameless, and when he lifted her hips up, she braced herself on her elbows and her knees, reaching for him as best she could. "Mine," Noah growled. "Mine, all mine, and no one will take you from me again." He thrust into her, making them both moan, and then he drew back slightly, only to thrust into the hilt again. "Oh my God," Stephanie whimpered brokenly. She was murmuring his name, asking him for more, telling him in every way possible how much she had missed him, and how very much she needed him. She reared herself back to his thrusts, and the pressure was building low in her belly. With every thrust he stroked the fire higher, and she thought that she would never survive wanting him, never survive the burning climax that was soon to come. She was clawing at the dirt as if she was in heat, and perhaps that wasn't far off. Her skin felt like it was burning, and he was the only one who could soothe her. His fingers dug tight into her hips for a moment, and then he reached underneath her with one hand, only slackening his pace slightly. She yelped when his skilled fingers found the small nub at the core of her, rubbing it with a touch that was at once skilled and gentle. She didn't know which way to push or to turn. All she was a series of sensations, stretched too far. The deep tug of desire in her grew harder and harder, and almost subconsciously, she found herself resisting it, wanting it to go on even longer. However, Noah was not a man who would abide her resistance. He redoubled his efforts, and then between his body slamming into her and his fingers slyly arousing her, Stephanie had to give up. Her shriek echoed through the trees, and the climax electrified her from head to toe. She was a doctor. She knew what was happening. She knew that her muscles were shaking with release and that her mind was reeling from the pleasure that Noah had just given her. In that moment, however, the doctor was gone, replaced only by the woman. She shook with the force of her release, burying her face in her hands. It was too much. It was far too much to take. The waves of pleasure washed over her, and then she felt him coming as well. His hands pulled her hard to him, and he spilled inside her. A pleasure as deep as it was primal. This was the way it was meant to finish, she thought. Him inside her, giving her his essence, and Stephanie felt a kind of peace that she had never encountered before. She felt him kissing her between her shoulders, down the bumps of her spine, and then he pulled away gently. She would have thought that the climax would leave both of them shaken, but then she felt herself being lifted again. Lazily, she looped her arms around his neck, gazing at him as he carried her back towards the water. "Are you seriously still strong enough to carry me like a blushing bride?" she asked, raising her eyebrow at him. He grinned at her, lazy and full of affection. "Being with you energizes me," he said. "I could wrestle a dozen snakes, kill 50 hyenas." She shuddered as he carried her into the water. "I hope you won't be called upon to do that," she grumbled. "Oh, that's cold." He didn't stop until they were in the shelter of a rock overhang. There was a ledge under the water forming a perfect bench, and he sat there with her, holding her in his lap. With her back to his chest, Stephanie lolled against him. Everything felt slightly sleepy, slightly far away. His hands roamed up and down her body, softened by the water. When he started to rub and pet her between her spread legs, she whimpered a little. "I love you," he whispered in her ear. "You are mine. I love you." She gasped when he caught her in a particularly sensitive spot, and then she nodded. I love you," she stuttered, and he made a soft, inquisitive noise next to her ear. God, maybe she could put together a real sentence if only he would let her gather her thoughts for a moment. "You don't sound sure. Or is it that something frightens you?" She shuddered and wiggled in his grasp. She wasn't trying to get away. She needed more of his touch. But he was keeping it maddeningly light. I'm not afraid when I'm with you," she whispered. "It's just that love, it's so big. I have so much of it in my heart for you, and for the baby, and Her back arched, and this time she was quiet as he brought her to another orgasm. Her shout was locked in her throat, emerging only as the tiniest of whispers when she came. It was as powerful as the first, however, and her entire body shook. If Noah hadn't been holding her in place with his arm around her waist, she might have fallen off him into the water. "You are mine," he repeated as she came. "I will look after you and the child, and all will be well." God help me, but I believe him, she thought, and she rested back against the wall of his body. Chapter 11. 2 days of easy hiking took them to the refuge that Noah had promised. By the time they came to the small and hidden valley, Noah was recovered from the exhaustion of his mad run, and Stephanie's nightmares about her time with the snakes were slowing to a stop. "This place is terribly isolated," Stephanie said, looking around, and Noah shrugged. It's safe, he said, and I think you'll find that it is less isolated than you might fear. She started to say something in response, but then there was a delighted shout. Marnie and Jessica burst from the trees, looking as healthy and happy as Stephanie had ever seen them, and to her shock, they both wrapped their arms around her. "Oh my God, you're here! You're safe!" Jessica cried. "We were so worried about you." "When Marcus told me that you were pregnant, I wanted to march right back and make sure that you were all right," Marnie said, her eyes large and sad. "We couldn't stop thinking about you the whole way here." "I'm fine. Well, I'm fine now. I hiked out on my own, and Noah found me." Stephanie decided to keep her story of torment from the snake shifters to herself, at least for now. At the moment, it was still too new and raw. She glanced over to see that Marcus was talking with Noah. Noah, even in his human form, looked somewhat dire, as if he would like nothing more than to cuff the other man. But at least he was listening to what Marcus said. Soon enough, she and Noah were escorted to a small stone cottage set deep into a shadowy glen. There were a few other cottages nearby, but Stephanie fell immediately in love with this one. There was a charm made of gold-colored ribbons and bells above the door, and it immediately made her think of Noah's eyes. "Welcome," he said softly, and he guided her in. To Stephanie's surprise, she found that it was an utterly modern little house, a strange thing to find in the heart of the wilds. There was a real kitchen, and a bedroom with an enormous bed at the center of it, a snow-white comforter over the top and drapes of mosquito netting giving it a gorgeously fairy tale feel. "I can barely believe this place is here," she said, falling down on the bed, and every inch the smug lion, Noah curled next to her. "It is yours because it is mine," he said. "This is my home when I am not traveling for the council, and this is where we shall live." Stephanie turned her head to regard him warily. You know that isn't a done deal, right? We've not talked about anything in detail." He looked at her curiously, and it struck her that he was not even perturbed. There was something patient and endlessly enduring about Noah, something that struck her as more lion than human. "You love me," he said calmly. "I can feel it. Why wouldn't you stay with me?" "You love me too," she protested, and he nodded as if it was a given statement, something that did not require discussion. "Of course I love you. I need you like grass needs the sun, like people need water. Why shouldn't we stay here, where it is safe, where your skills can be of value?" Stephanie had heard from the other women that the local village was well on its way to recovering from the plague that had afflicted it, but there would, of course, be other issues to be treated, and nearby villages to administer to as well. She knew that her skills would be in demand, and she relented for the moment. "We can try this," Stephanie said hesitantly, and Noah grinned enormously, gathering her into his arms. "Good," he said, and then he started kissing her. Stephanie let go of her doubts for the moment, but still they lingered, ready to pounce out at her at odd moments from the back of her head. For the span of 6 months, things went smoothly. Stephanie was happier than she had ever been. She went with Marnie and Jessica to the village to help with the villagers with their recovery, and they in turn grew closer to her. Jessica quietly confided in Stephanie that she and Marcus were trying to conceive, inspired by the idea of Stephanie and Noah having a family. "It's something that I've always wanted, and I know he wants it too. We were both just wary of whether it would be a success with a human and a shifter. What would happen if the baby was only human, you know?" When Stephanie reported that to Noah late that night, he snorted. "No such thing as just a human. Not when you're born of people like Marcus and Jessica. He said, any child with their courage and strength is a sight for sore eyes in this world. And for yourself? Stephanie asked, finally daring to voice her fear. She cradled her hand over the now distinct bump, feeling their child shift lazily under her touch. Will you be satisfied if our baby is just an ordinary human? Noah's fierce, golden gaze softened a little, and he dragged her close. Any child that has you for a mother will never be ordinary, he promised. No matter what our child is, I will welcome her, love her, and protect her for all her born days. Stephanie was content with that, but sometimes late at night when Noah slept, she tangled her fingers in his golden hair and wondered, would her daughter truly be a priority for her father if she couldn't transform? If she had to reach for him with delicate human arms, if she would never be able to run and leap by his side? As her pregnancy drew on, she supposed that fear was responsible for some of her frustration and moodiness. She never became unfriendly or mean, but she could feel herself becoming more distant with her friends, and even her lover. She knew that she was worrying them, but every effort to bring herself back into the circle felt strange and awkward. That was perhaps the reason why she exploded so badly when the word came through from the council. It's a simple action on the coast, Noah told her, packing his gear. There was something she hated about it, that he was going as if it was a foregone conclusion, as if she would, of course, be happy to be on her own for however long it took them to finish their mission. I should be back in 2 weeks. 3 weeks is when I'm due, Stephanie said, her voice as level as she could make it. Are you really going to tell me that you're going to miss our child's birth? Are you telling me that the precious council is so very important to you that you refuse to stay? Noah looked at her curiously, and somehow there was nothing in his eyes that said he understood what a betrayal this was. I will be back long before the little cub arrives, he said. Have faith. What if it takes longer? She said, her voice rising. First children often arrive quickly. What if there is trouble when she is born? I am not young for my first. Noah shook his head, returning to his packing. You were overly worried, he said, not even looking at her. I would never miss her birth. I would never leave you alone. But you are, Stephanie cried, furious. She was angry because it was better than being afraid. Her hands shook. You are choosing the council over me. That he heard. Noah spun around, and there was a terrible rage on his face. Never say that to me again, he growled. My loyalty and my love to you are unquestioned, or should be. Tell that to the council, Stephanie said, not faltering at all. She could feel the fury fueled with grief that he would leave her like this. It stung so badly that she wanted to weep, but she would not permit it. Instead, she laid both hands over her belly and looked up at her man challengingly. Tell the council that your child and your woman are more important than they are to you. See how far you get. She hadn't known that Noah could roar in his human form as well. She was shaken by the force of it, and then he transformed into a lion. With a single bound, he like a mountain had settled over her heart. Her words tasted like poison on her lips, but she had no idea how to spit it out. All she could think about was the fact that Noah was leaving her and their unborn child, and God only knew when he would be back. She lay there for hours, and perhaps she slept. When Jessica came to wake her, there was a darkness to the sky that hadn't been there before. Come on, Jessica said. Noah hunted. She was startled, but allowed Jessica to guide her along the path to the village, where there was a cook fire smoldering. A pair of fat antelope, skinned and dressed, were roasting in the pit, and she saw Noah across the fire, his face impassive, but his eyes bright. "The villagers say that he has hunted and killed enough for everyone to have a full meal, and far more," Jessica whispered. "No one knows why he did it." "I do," Stephanie said, and she went around the fire to meet Noah. "Do you understand?" he asked, his voice gruff, and he seemed relieved when she touched his chest, settling herself close to him. "I do," she said. "You will provide for me. You can provide for a village. You can care for a village. You can care for me. You will return to me and our child." "Yes," he said with relief. "Stephanie, you are my heart. You are the light of my skies. I will return to you for the birth of our child." "I know you will," she said, and she leaned up to kiss him. "Okay, hang on, Stephanie, you're almost there. You're almost fully dilated. It won't be long now," said Jessica, wiping Stephanie's lank hair away from her eyes. Stephanie groaned and panted. Screaming had been left far behind. Now she felt simply as if she were suspended in a terrible hell, giving birth to a daughter without any relief in sight. Honey, you're doing great," Marnie said comfortingly. "You're doing so well." Stephanie clung to Marnie's small hand, but she couldn't respond to the encouragement at all. She was exhausted. She had nothing left, and in the center of her was a terrible emptiness. "Where's Noah?" she asked. At this point, she didn't care if she sounded like a helpless doormat. She had asked the question a countless number of times, and each time, the response had been the same. Marnie or Jessica shook their heads sadly, and she had fallen back distraught on the pillow. "It's going to be okay. It will be," Jessica said desperately, her skilled hands touching her gently. "It will be. You're doing well." "But Noah isn't here. He said he would be here, but he isn't." Just then, an enormous roar filled the air, so loud it seemed to shake the earth the medical trailer rested on. There was a tearing sound as Noah ripped the door open, just now transforming into a human and completely naked. "Hands! For the love of God, wash your hands!" Jessica snapped. For a moment, Stephanie thought that Noah would ignore her. But he did as she said, scrubbing his hands hard and even taking a pair of trousers stashed in one of the small cabinets. He came to her, and in that moment, she felt a surge of strength go through her. She clung to his hand, she looked into his deep golden eyes, and she could feel a lion's ferocity fill her inside. "I am so sorry, my love. Forgive me," he murmured, kissing her hand. "Forgive me." "You're here now. That's all that matters," she murmured. "I love you, Noah. I love you so—" Noah opened his mouth to speak, and then Jessica was interrupting. "You're dilated all the way now, hun. Want to try to push?" "I think I have to," Stephanie panted. "All right then. Noah, get down here, because your baby is coming." Stephanie pushed with what felt like the last of her strength. She shut her eyes tightly, and she reached for the leonine ferocity that had appeared within her. She was the mate of a lion shifter. She was a skilled doctor. She was not going to let this defeat her. She was screaming with the pain of it, and then there was another voice screaming as well, new and beautiful, taking her first breath in the world. "Oh God, is that... There was a flurry of motion, and she could see Jessica showing Noah where to cut the cord. Then he was bearing the cleaned newborn to her, and in awe, she lifted her shirt so that their little one could lie on bare skin. "She's a beautiful girl," Noah whispered, and he kissed Stephanie gently on the forehead, coming to sit as close to her as he could. With her daughter crying lustily on her chest and her man by her side, Stephanie could feel a circle complete itself. It's love, she thought. It's a pure and wild love. She smiled at Noah, and she relaxed into the arm he threw over her shoulders. You are mine, he whispered, and this time she gave herself over to it. And you are mine, she murmured in turn, looking forward to raising their daughter together and sharing a long life with a love that shook mountains and overran rivers. The end. This has been Mauled, Were Soldier Warriors, Book 3. Written by Kim Dillon. Narrated by Nikki Kwiatkowski. Copyright 2017 by Lovestruck Romance. Production copyright 2018 by Kim Dillon.